you this morning, and it's really good to see such a distinguished audience present here for this very important roundtable, which is being jointly organized by Institute of Chinese Studies and Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, SIIS, in collaboration with India International Center. As you know, the theme of this morning's conversation will be on perspectives in India-China relations and trends and developments in the Indo-Pacific. We greatly appreciate the presence here of Professor Chen Tung-Xiao, President SIIS, and his colleagues who have traveled from Shanghai to join us. And I would also like to welcome Shyam Sharan and all the senior colleagues who are present here. So we had a very fascinating high-level conversation in Shanghai in June last year, which was hosted by Professor Chen, and we decided to continue this dialogue, and we're meeting again today, and we hope that this will become an annual feature because both sides found this conversation to be mutually beneficial. Friends, so we are meeting at a time of both hope and anxiety about the present state and prospects of India-China relations. As you know, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping will hold their second informal summit in India soon. Dates have not been announced, but there is talk of the summit taking place sometime in October. They had the first informal summit in Wuhan in April last year, which was widely seen as a success. It was described by President Xi as a new starting point in bilateral relations, while Prime Minister Modi had characterized it as a milestone in the relationship. And there are obviously great expectations from the second informal summit, which will take place shortly. The important point to note here is kind of investment the two top leaders of India and China have made in taking forward this very important relationship. They had their hometown diplomacy first, with President Xi being received in Gandhinagar, Ahmedabad, by Prime Minister Modi in 2014, and 2015 Prime Minister Modi traveling to Xi'an, where President Xi received him, and then they started this process of informal summits, which hope will become a regular feature. This roundtable is taking place at a time of acute uncertainty in the international environment. The geopolitical landscape, as you are aware, is characterized by intensification of strategic contestation, unilateralism, worries linked to regional hotspots, and terrorism, as also sharpening arms race. On the economic side too, the global economic situation has deteriorated. The International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook of 2nd April suggests that after strong growth in 2017, early 2018, global economic activity has slowed notably since the second half of last year. We are confronted with resurgent protectionism, rising tide of populism, anti-globalization tendencies, and of course there are widespread concerns about so-called US-China trade and technology war and differences which have surfaced, and kind of impact it's having, and what is apprehended in terms of implications for global economic situation. In this period of turbulence and unpredictability, we would like to see India-China relations developing as a factor of stability. I think this is a shared desire on part of both countries. This relationship, if you review it, has a very impressive track record of achievements, yet it carries the burden of accumulated differences and mutual doubts. We must acknowledge that there are certain structural problems in the relationship which are coming in the way of smooth development of India-China relations. For instance, differences have surfaced recently between the two countries on the issue of Jammu and Kashmir and Sino-Pak strategic linkages. These differences, in a sense, illustrate structural challenges that we have, as do the problem of trade deficit imbalance that we have between two countries. There are also reports about recurrence of standoff situations in India-China border areas. Apart from accumulation of bilateral concerns on both sides, there is also the challenge of managing overlapping areas of influence, both land and maritime. Another challenge stems from the fact that we do not seem to be quite on the same page regarding the geostrategic objectives in the region and beyond. There are doubts about each other's strategic intentions. Against this background, one can argue that it's desirable to move towards a new modus vivendi between our two countries. It cannot be business as usual. We cannot afford to have something similar to boom-bust cycle that we witness in the business environment. We can't afford to have a serious deterioration in India-China relations. Hopefully that will not happen. The new paradigm of the relationship will require, above all, building on positives and convergences in the relationship. Just to give you an example, we have the agreed template of closer developmental partnership, which essentially is predicated on the assessment on both sides that growth stories of India and China are mutually fulfilling, and that we can derive benefit and opportunities from what's happening in China, and converse is equally true. We expect closer developmental partnership to be a major focus of discussions at the second informal summit. We also need to explore a very wide measure of convergence, at times not fully appreciated, that exists between two countries on regional, multilateral, and global issues, and the need to forge a new agenda for cooperation on those issues. How do we work together to shape the emerging global agenda at a time of uncertainty and unpredictability is both a challenge and opportunity for us. The updated paradigm will also require, we have to acknowledge progress towards addressing outstanding issues, including the boundary question and trade imbalance. We can't keep postponing the resolution of these issues. It will also require careful management of differences and not letting them turn into disputes. It will require some understanding on how to manage the simultaneous rise of the two countries, on how to accommodate each other's concerns, interests, and aspirations with respect to specific issues and theaters. It's not enough to engage in routine exchange of views on regional, multilateral, global issues. Instead, the focus should be on developing greater strategic convergence, paying attention to each other's sensitivities. It will also require the updated paradigm that I'm talking about. It will also require recalibrating relations in the midst of a rapidly changing regional and global environment. So today we'll be discussing India-China relations, our perspectives on that, and I'm sure we'll have a very productive conversation. But we're also going to discuss trends and developments in the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific, straddling across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, has gained considerable currency as a geographical construct and geopolitical region of great significance. In this globalizing world, transnational interests of countries have moved well beyond traditional geographical categorizations. It's difficult, for instance, to consider Asia-Pacific as a valid construct if it excludes India, as it traditionally does. This has necessitated a reimagining of the region, whereby the Indo-Pacific as a natural region is being recognized as a more relevant geographical entity compared to the Asia-Pacific. A recent development in acknowledgement of the Indo-Pacific construct is the adoption of ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific at the ASEAN Summit in Bangkok in June this year. The ASEAN position is in fact quite similar to the position articulated by India on the new Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific, however, we have to recognize, remains a work in progress. We do not have consensus yet on the geographical scope or contours of the Indo-Pacific. In his keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue at Singapore on 1st June last year, Prime Minister Modi remarked that the Indo-Pacific is stretched from the shores of Africa to the shores of America. The US, on the other hand, offers a much narrower definition of Indo-Pacific, from Hollywood to Bollywood, that it stops at the western coast of India. The positions articulated by the ASEAN and Japan regarding the scope of Indo-Pacific are more similar to what India has advocated. The Chinese position is still evolving in this regard, and we look forward to hearing views of our Chinese colleagues this morning. But one point I would like to highlight here, that as a major power of the Indo-Pacific region, China has to play a very important role in shaping the discourse, the evolving discourse on Indo-Pacific. In his remarks at the Shangri-La Dialogue, Prime Minister Modi spelled out India's thinking on the subject and addressed some of the apprehensions regarding the concept, including those articulated by China. We are aware of some concerns China has with regard to the construct of Indo-Pacific. Prime Minister Modi made it clear that India doesn't see the Indo-Pacific region as a strategy or as a club of limited members, nor as a grouping that seeks to dominate, and by no means to be considered as directed against any country. I'm quoting from the remarks he had made, keynote address he has given at Shangri-La Dialogue in June last year. In Prime Minister Modi's vision, inclusiveness, openness, ASEAN centrality and unity, and rule-based order lie at the heart of the new Indo-Pacific. However, as this concept is still work in progress, as I mentioned earlier, it's for the stakeholders of the region, including India and China, to shape the contours of the concept Indo-Pacific through bilateral consultations, in regional platforms like the East Asia Summit, and through conversations like the one we are having today. Let me, in conclusion, once again extend a very warm welcome to Ambassador Chen Tungxiao and his colleagues, and we are looking forward to a very productive conversation, and we'll continue the dialogue by inviting Professor Chen to deliver his opening remarks. Over to you, Professor Chen.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Counter, Ambassador Saran, as well as many ambassadors here. It is our great honor to be invited by Ambassador Counter, as well as his colleagues of ICS. As a co-organizers of this dialogue, I would also, on behalf of the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, to extend a warm welcome and appreciation of your time to come to this dialogue. And as the president of SIIS, I also I'm very pleased to see the intensifying of our interaction and bilateral interactions and cooperation with ICS under Ambassador Counter's initiative and a strong support. I think that in the past few years, our dialogue between two sides has been very fruitful and enlightening. Without Ambassador's leadership and his advice, it is impossible for us to have such kind of a annual dialogue. Last year, SIIS has somewhat reshuffled, and then we set up a new center, South Asian China Center. We also very much pleased to have our ambassadorial consul general of China to Mumbai to join Ambassador Liu to join us as the first director of this new center. We have already in the process of recruiting a new colleagues, new members to join our program. And also we try to have already in the process of expand our academic reach out and network building in South Asia by more joint conferences, joint projects, and more intensive exchange of visits in the future. I fully share, I would like to echo Ambassador Kanter's some of the points that we are at a critical juncture. We have approached at a critical juncture of grand shifts of international and regional order. One of the defining features of this shift, of this grand transformation, is the shifting of the center of a geo-economic and geopolitical gravity from transatlantic towards Asia, Indo-Pacific, coupled with many consequences. Some of them predictable, but some of them are still unpredictable. I would just outline some of those, give a list of those consequences and implications. Number one is the economic globalization, or put it more precisely, the transatlantic center globalization now has encountered more headwinds, face more challenge and difficulties in terms of its deficits of governance, deficits of development, deficits of trust, as well as the stability. This globalization, ever since the 1990s, last century, has faced more headwinds of anti-globalization, protectionism. And we have seen the multilateralism has been undermined by growing unilateralism. And we have seen that some of the most established existing multilateral mechanisms, institutions, like WTO and the Bretton Woods institutions, their prospect and the reform directions are much more uncertain. Therefore, we have seen both the rising of nationalism as well as the rising of a regional, trans-regional, and sub-regional cooperation. So these two trends come together. I think no one would like to be nostalgic of those old days of a state-centric international relations, which is governed by those overarching norms of nationalism, let alone those ultra-nationalism. At the same time, at global level, those multilateralism has faced the biggest challenge, unprecedented uncertainty in their development. That has indicated some of the prospect of the booming of more regional, sub-regional, trans-regional mechanism of cooperation. So we have already seen that kind of a booming. And what are these implications for a global governance and globalization? Secondly, we also have seen, as Ambassador Kanter said, that with those grand shifts from the transatlantic center towards Asia and Indo-Pacific area, we have seen on one side the rise of a strategic competition among and between the big powers. Of course, U.S.-China relationship has somewhat strained in this broad context. And defining features of those tensions. Now we talk more about those tariff trade or the tariff war, trade war. But we all know that the essence of those competition lies in the competition over the technology, which will decide the future of economic development. And those kind of tension has already spilled over to many other areas. In addition to those trade and tariff war trade disputes between US and China, we have seen that those trade tension disputes are all around the world, largely triggered by the unilateralism or protectionism by the United States. Can we mitigate those rising tension of trade or trade warfare? Can we navigate those uncharted waters of the prospect of which has been looming larger, that there will be a profound disruption or abrupt disruption of the global supply chain in an unpredictable way, in unpredictable manner. Of course, in addition to that, we also see that in numerous traditional, non-traditional security hotspots are still there. Most recently, the tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia over those attacks of those installations of Saudi Arabia's oil installation has wreaked havoc on global energy market. And I think as the biggest buyer of those gas and oil, like India and China, we suffer from those chaotic, very turbulent geopolitical tensions, regional hotspot. And what all those stakeholders, like India and China, can do to help, along with others, to stabilize those situations. As Ambassador Kanta also mentioned about Asia and Indo-Pacific area, I think that one of the Indian or the Asia and the Indo-Pacific area, generally speaking, we have continued to see that this area is the most economically dynamic area. And we have seen that regional economic cooperation are still ongoing despite of those difficulties. But at the same time, regarding those geostrategic perspective, and we also witness the rising of uncertainties. And one of the causes of those rising uncertainty is there are a competing vision of how to form or formulate a regional architecture or regional security architecture in particular in this area. We have seen that so many countries have issued their vision, outlook, or strategy on Indo-Pacific. And from Chinese perspective, I think Beijing is quite open to any proposal, regional cooperation proposal, as long as those proposals aims at uniting the region rather than disintegrating the region. As long as those proposals are for economic and social development and cohesion, rather than try to destabilize the region by focusing on the ideology or narrowly defined ideology or interests. As long as those proposals are for inclusiveness, multilateralism, rather than for unilateralism or hegemony. So in that regard, we have seen some of, as Ambassador Counter mentioned, the converging overlapped areas of those proposals or strategy or vision. At the same time, there are obvious differences among those different outlooks of visions and strategy on Indo-Pacific. So I think that we are living in a very critical juncture, both at global and the regional level. And India and China are the most two important players, economies, the most important emerging economies in this area. And the stake is extremely high for both sides to continue, as Ambassador Kanta mentioned. We should work together as a stabilizer of this increasingly unpredictable and turbulent era. But how to tap the potential of becoming a stabilizer? We have to recognize there are still quite a number of problems, challenges. But I think that the leaders of both sides, the Prime Minister Modi, as well as the President of China, Xi Jinping, through their very intensive interaction and exchange of views and visits, they cherish this vision as these two big civilizations and leading emerging economy. It is their natural, it is their unavoidable responsibility to form kind of a co-leadership to help stabilize the regional as well as global situation. And I think that a lot of task forces are still ahead of us. And we have so many distinguished colleagues today, as well as many ambassadors here. I think that the time just could not be better as an upcoming visit of President Xi and his meeting with His Excellency Prime Minister Modi. So we are looking forward to the momentum of continuing strengthening the bilateral relationship, to bring this bilateral to a new height through their personal chemistry. And I believe that we have enough confidence. But as a think tank people, as opinion leader here, we also should, work out to try to tap the potential of cooperation. Work out the list of those potential and existing cooperation, and try to give the advice to our governments respectively, as well as to shape the opinion of two societies, to let them know that the potential of these two great countries of cooperation is tremendous. And but not working together, if we cannot work together, the stake is also extremely high and costly. So I will stop here. I look forward to a very fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, President Chan, for those very thoughtful remarks about emerging international situations, many challenges that it poses for us, about developments in India-China relations, your thoughts on Indo-Pacific, and also how we can work together to shape the emerging agenda, including in context of upcoming informal summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi. Thank you very much for those remarks. I would now like to request Ambassador Shangsharan to deliver his remarks.
Thank you very much, Ashok. Let me join you in extending a very warm welcome to President Chen Tung-xiao and all the distinguished members of the delegation from the prestigious Shanghai Institute for International Studies. As has been pointed out by both Ashok and President Chan, that this visit and our interaction is taking place at a very opportune time. Although we do not have the dates as yet of the second informal summit, but we presume that it will happen very soon. Both leaders are very much looking forward to that interaction. This is the second after the first, very unusual and I think kind of a pioneering format of interaction between the leaders was inaugurated in Wuhan in April last year, and we have now a new phrase. This is the Wuhan spirit in India-China relations, and there is no doubt that this spirit has become a very major impulse in India-China relations. It has always been my belief that over the last several years, regular summits between Indian and Chinese leaders have played a very important and positive stabilizing role in our relations, and are to be welcomed even if at times there may not be any substantive outcome. On many occasions in the past, such summits have taken place when there has been a certain spike in tensions between the two countries for one reason or another. As I said, even if the problem itself, which may have given rise to tensions, maybe some incident at the border or some other issue, these summits have in fact played a very important role in conveying to the systems on both sides, to bureaucracies on both sides, that leaders are in fact committed to having good relations between the two countries, attach importance to the relations between the two countries, and this results therefore in a certain extra effort by us diplomats and others to try and manage, if not resolve, outstanding issues, and to make certain that such issues do not disrupt our relations. So at least from that point of view, I think these summits have been very important, and from that perspective, I certainly believe that the forthcoming second informal summit will also have a positive impact on our relations. Now, both our speakers have referred to the fact that the international situation is become very complex. It has become very volatile. I think we have been hearing these phrases for quite some time now, that the international situation is not really settling down, that there are new threats to international peace and security which are emerging. And these are not only security threats, but they also have today a economic dimension, very important economic dimension. President Chan referred to the recent incident of drone attacks on Saudi oil fields. I would say that this actually represents a very new phenomena in the military domain, because what you are witnessing is that technological advances are sometimes enabling a relatively cheap but lethal device, which is both difficult to detect and difficult to deter. And they can inflict damage on a massive scale, which is what we have seen. So this is something new that is happening, and something that countries which are have a stake in maintenance of international peace and security need to reflect upon what the implications of these developments are, because I don't think that it is fully understood that there is this new kind of a phenomena which has become a new source of threat to international peace and security. And we need to be able to work together to try and contain, if not eliminate, such threats. Of course, the attack not only damages the Saudi economy, but it imperils the economic security and energy security of several countries. And both India and China are major purchasers of Middle East oil and gas. And any disruption, particularly extended disruption of these supplies, will obviously have serious consequences on our economic well-being. So, as the two countries which are perhaps the largest consumers of energy resources which come from this region, is there not a shared interest between the two countries in maintenance of peace and security in the region? And perhaps the time has come for us to explore ways and means in which we can contribute to that objective. So when we have been talking about what are our convergent interests and should we not try to work on those convergent interests, here is something which is really staring us in the face. Now, the maritime space which joins the Indian and Pacific Oceans, which we now call Indo-Pacific, and President Chan has referred to this as Asia Indo-Pacific. This connected ocean space is very important because a very large proportion of the ocean-borne trade of the world, in fact, traverses this ocean space. And this is particularly true of energy supplies, precisely what I spoke about just now. It is estimated that about 40% of China's trade and about 30% of India's trade, in fact, traverses this particular ocean space. And therefore, it stands to reason that maritime security, again, is a key and shared concern between India and China. Now, India has consistently declared that it would wish to see a maritime security architecture, and this responds to what President Chan mentioned, that we should perhaps be thinking in terms of what is the kind of appropriate maritime or security architecture which we should have for this very important region. And I think in this context, I would like to draw your attention to several assertions which have been made at the highest level in India, that we would like to see a maritime security architecture in our region, which is one, open, it is inclusive, it is transparent, and it should be balanced. So these are the four characteristics which we believe must underlie any kind of security architecture. And I believe that this is something which our Chinese friends would not have any issue with. Now, why have we said this? We have said this because it is also true that if you look at the last 10 to 15 years, the highest increases in military expenditures have taken place in our region. So if you look at East Asia, if you look at Southeast Asia, if you look at South Asia, if you look at this particular space, all the countries in the region are actually investing large sums of money in defense, and in particularly in maritime defense. Why is that? Because there is this a sense of concern and anxiety about the events that are taking place in the region, and the fact that there is also we are also witnessing a growing confrontation among the powers. Now, of course, so therefore, one way of trying to ensure your security is by taking unilateral steps to build up your capabilities. But actually, the more logical and perhaps the more efficient way of ensuring security is not through seeking unilateral security, but through seeking mutual security. That is, providing some architecture which provide mutual assurances of security. That would obviate the kind of major investment which we are seeing today in defense assets, but in particular maritime assets. And I think in this context, what we do work together to try and bring that kind of architecture into being, this is going to have a very major impact for the future. Now, of course, as we have said that there is a certain new era of geopolitical contestation which we are beginning to see in the world and including in our region. China-US relations have been, of course, negatively impacted by the trade wars. These trade wars have impacts which are not only limited to the US and Chinese economies, they are having impacts all over the world. But I think this is our judgment, that even if compromises are made in this trade war, it is unlikely that US-China relations will regain what used to be by and large a cooperative and positive spirit which prevailed in the past. I think that age is now past, as far as we can see. And it is also our belief that this is because there are now structural reasons behind the change in this dynamic of US-China relations. It is now a geopolitical contestation, of which the trade war is only a symptom. For India, of course, we have always held that both China-US confrontation and conversely possibility of US-China collusion, both these do not suit India. Both these have a restrictive impact on India. It's, as I said, shrinks our room for maneuver. But at this particular point of time, of course, the threat which we see is that there will be a rapid slide towards US-China confrontation. But this raises a very important issue. We have seen in the past that Chinese approach and sentiment towards India has been to some extent also influenced by its relationship, the state of its relationship with the US. Whenever it has faced some pressure from the United States, it becomes a little more positive towards India. Whenever those relations improve, then India then goes down in the priority list as far as China is concerned. I think that situation must change. China must begin to look at its relations with India in a strategic context, not as a tactical kind of a relationship. The reason why I'm saying this is that China sometimes looks at India through the prism of its confrontation with the United States. We should not get into a situation of either you are with me or against me. I think that's not the manner in which we can take the relationship forward. So my sense is, and I would like to make this explicit, that as far as our relations are concerned, in our perspective, these relations have a logic of their own. These relations have an intrinsic value of their own, and they need to be handled in that context. Now, of course, we have stated that there are issues on which India and China have convergent interests. I have described some of those. We should be prepared to work on them for our mutual benefit. But if it is a relationship which is looked upon from the strategic perspective, then on issues where our interests may not be convergent, or at least currently may not be convergent, I think there should be a willingness to engage in regular dialogue which is able to prevent any misunderstanding and misperception. This, I think, is also very important. So engagement is not only to look at the positive elements in the relationship, but I think the engagement has to be also prepared to confront some of the issues which divide us and see if we are not able to resolve them, how do we manage them, try to understand what is the perspective from which the other side is coming. I think if we are able to at least adopt that kind of approach, this would have a beneficial impact on India-China relations. Now, of course, because we are talking about the Indo-Pacific, so let me also touch upon that. China has, of course, expressed reservations about the concept of Indo-Pacific, which it believes that, or at least some commentators in China believe, that this could evolve into an anti-China security arrangement, something like Asian NATO. That is the term sometimes which has been used. Now, why has India, welcomed this concept? It has welcomed this concept because quite clearly the old Asia-Pacific generally denoted East Asia, but excluded India. And I think that point was also covered. The difference between Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific is precisely the inclusion of India. And it is appropriate and logical given the fact that India's economic and security profile has steadily expanded eastward through the phases of Look East and now Act East. Most countries of Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea have welcomed India's closer engagement with the region. As I said, India advocates an open and inclusive architecture in the region. So Indo-Pacific is certainly not intended to contain China. Some anxiety has also arisen about India being a member of the so-called Quad, which is a consultative forum amongst the US, Japan, Australia, and India. And this has raised suspicions that this too may perhaps be a precursor to some kind of an anti-China military alliance. The Quad has its genesis, and I was closely associated with that genesis, in the close cooperation amongst the naval forces of the four countries in the aftermath of the 2005 tsunami, where the four countries worked together to deliver urgent relief and assistance to affected countries. And that cooperation in dealing with maritime emergencies led the four democratic countries to consider institutionalizing their naval cooperation to deal with future maritime threats and emergencies. India does not see the grouping as something more than a consultative forum at this point of time, in which we, of course, look at maritime security issues. India has bilateral security arrangements with each of the Quad countries. China too has such military cooperation agreements with various countries. But this is not a multilateral arrangement. And this is an important distinction. We have, if you look at it objectively, we have today even higher scale of security cooperation in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where we actually have exercises together for anti-terrorism. But the SU also is not a military alliance. So India looks upon its engagement with the region and the world as essentially proceeding through a series of concentric circles. Its partnerships are issue-based. Therefore, I believe that China's doubts about the Quad are misplaced. I would like to add just a few observations before I conclude about the role of ASEAN and India's strategic partnership with the grouping. We see no contradiction between our explicit acknowledgement of ASEAN's centrality in any regional security architecture and the promotion of Indo-Pacific cooperation. And Ashok made a reference to the June statement from ASEAN in this way. We see the concept unfolding through ASEAN-led processes and mechanisms. ASEAN centrality for us is not just a slogan or just a polite political gesture towards ASEAN friends. We believe that ASEAN provides a very valuable mediating and conciliation platform in managing, in fact, great power contestation in the region. This role has become even more important as this contestation in the region has become sharper day by day. It is for this reason that we believe that all major powers with stakes in the region must resist the temptation to divide ASEAN for narrow short-term gains. ASEAN unity is the basis of ASEAN centrality, and both India and China should value it and promote it. I have shared some personal perspectives on the themes for this interaction. I have no doubt that we shall greatly benefit from the perspectives of our Chinese friends, and may I compliment the Institute for Chinese Studies and its director, Ambassador Ashok and President Chan Tung Xiao of SIIS for their initiative in organizing this important interaction. And I express the hope that this collaboration between our two prestigious and highly respected institutions becomes an annual feature. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for those very thoughtful, thought-provoking remarks. You covered so much ground I've not even tried to summarize what you said. But in fact, encouraged by observations made by both President Chan and Ambassador Shamsharan, we'll deviate slightly from the program that we had circulated. So before we start session one, which will be on India-China relations, I just discussed with President Chan. We'll take a few questions from you, and then we'll move on to session one. So the floor is open for just 2-3 questions which can be posed to President Chan and Ambassador Shamsharan.
Dear Ambassador Kantoy and Ambassador Saran, President, and all my colleagues, it is a privilege to me for me to come back to India again and again. I used to be serving as the Ambassadorial Consul General in Mumbai, so I always regard India as second home away from my home. Having said that, let me just come quickly to say just one flag thing. Let me just reflect from my heart that China has never regarded India as the strategic competitor. And China has never used India as a card vis-a-vis anybody. We can look at the history. So as a diplomat, both as a diplomat and as an economist, I say this from my heart. Now my question. I should appreciate it if Ambassador Saran could elaborate a little bit about the relations between India and the US, because right at the moment, US and China are arm twisting not only in trade, but also in technology, ideology. US has regarded the friction between China and United States as the friction between the civilizations, which to me I found no ground at all. But Ambassador Saran, could you share with us your relations with US? Thanks.
We'll take a couple of other questions.
We'll take a couple of other questions before we have responses. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash.
Good morning. Ambassador Shamsharan had mentioned about two possibilities or two ways of shaping the regional security architecture. Either China does it on its own, engages in individualism, or assumes a regional multilateral approach. Now, of late, I've been hearing that scholars have been talking about, and we all recognize that China is too big to be contained. But when it comes to preventing China from engaging in unilateralism, is it possible to restrain China by forums like Quad or other players in the region and beyond coming together and sending out that message that individualism is not the solution? So do you think, Ambassador Saran and other panelists, that it is possible to impact China and restrain China from continuing on this path of unilateralism? Thank you.
Ambassador Shamsharan.
Thank you very much. All the panelists have spoken about the different perspectives, from the Indian perspective on Indo-Pacific, the Chinese perspective, the ASEAN perspective. I would like to ask President Chan about what does he think about the about the Russian perspective, Russian perspective, because Russia is an important power as far as this region is concerned. Russia recently articulated its pivot to Asia strategy. After the discussions in Vladivostok recently, and we've seen the Chennai, I don't know why I said China instead of Chennai, but Chennai, Vladivostok, maritime connectivity, and what do you think? And of course, India's increasing growing presence in Vladivostok in terms of investments, manpower exports, etc. that Prime Minister Modi spoke about. If you would like to share some thoughts about what Russia would be doing on the
Professor Chogi.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Yes, as for Indo-Pacific, my humble observation is that India's vision on Indo-Pacific is only in the process. Because in this April, you set up Indo-Pacific department in your foreign ministry. But recently, just as Ambassador said, when Prime Minister Modi visited Vladivostok and he gave suggestion to set up the Vladivostok to Chennai shipping plan, and also Foreign Minister Jaishankar visited Moscow, and he held a speech there, but we cannot find a speech from the Foreign Minister's website of India. And I think he is planning to Russian side what is India's vision on Indo-Pacific. So, from my understanding, your Indo-Pacific vision is also in the process for me. So I would like to hear your understanding, and I agree with that ambassador's suggestion that the regional security architecture should be negotiated among all the major powers, including ASEAN. But now the regional security architecture is set up by the United States after the Second Cold War, and it excludes not only China but also Russia. Thank you.
I think two final questions, Master Yogendra Kumar and then Master Jayant.
Thank you.
We'll come back later to this.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not quite
Keep it quite short because
I'm not quite a China watcher, but whatever little I've been reading about Chinese commentaries, I think the Chinese analysts recognize that India actually has what they consider to be more of an autonomy of decision making, and that we are not part of any particular camp. My question actually here is to the panel, and perhaps if not answered now during the course of the seminar. First of all, I think the uncertainty which was talked about, I think it stems very largely, certainly in the Indo-Pacific, by what China's own interpretation of international maritime laws or international laws are concerned in the maritime sphere. Because I think that is one factor which is actually the source of a lot of this uncertainty. And I don't know how far this lack of clarity extends, because I'm actually quite surprised when China took the initiative on Jammu and Kashmir, and they said that their interests are affected because of the abrogation of Article 370. And they refer at the same time to the UN resolutions. But the UN resolutions talk about choice for the people of Jammu and Kashmir with India and Pakistan. We're just wondering if China actually has a position on Kashmir. How does it square with this? So I'm basically highlighting this point basically to say that a lot of this thing which we're talking about arises from lack of clarity on the part of China itself, and perhaps I think there's something to look forward to. Thank you.
Last question, Master Jayant Bhagwati.
Only to sort of correct the imbalance. I think a number of questions and points have been raised on the security and defense related issues. On the economic side, on the bilateral side, I'm a little curious, given the fact that the Chinese economy is at least 5, if not 6 times the size of our economy. It's only in our populations that we are somewhat comparable. When it comes to technology, China perhaps might be at the forefront of 5G technology, and there's just one little element that I'm mentioning. Why is it that at the bilateral front, China insists that India's IT service products as well as pharmaceutical products have to go through Chinese state agencies, often making it difficult for Indian exporters to make inroads into Chinese markets? That is at the bilateral level. The RCEP negotiations are going to perhaps reach the final stages in Bangkok in November. I'm curious to know what China thinks about India's position in this matter. I personally feel it is too protective of our own industry and business houses, but I'd be very interested to hear what is your perspective as to how this process of RCEP should be taken forward. So one is the bilateral issue and the other is the multilateral. Thank you.
I think now I'll request President Chen Tung-Xiao and then the Vice Chancellor to respond. We are running behind schedule already quite a bit.
Well, thank you for all your comments and questions. And I think that's because of, for the interest of time, I would leave those specific issues regarding the more strategically bilateral relationship towards the next panel discussions. I will just touch upon one or two issues with some of the Indian colleagues mentioned. One, my understanding of Russia's perspective on Indo-Pacific. Number one, Russia, officially speaking, oppose any kind of Indo-Pacific idea, because they always ask, where's Asia? Where's the Russia's place? And what is the hidden agenda, ulterior motivation behind those Indo-Pacific strategy, particularly issued by Washington. Washington's strategy on Indo-Pacific stressed the so-called dichotomy between the maritime power vis-a-vis that of continental power, which tried to put the Russia as well as China into continental power. And you know what's the connotation of those kind of strategy means. Secondly, it is a very much ideology, narrowly defined ideology-based concept. Free, open, at the face value is a very beautiful word. But from Washington's perspective, I believe they try to, again, highlight or amplify the gap of differences between the so-called authoritarian states and those democratic states. Again, try to, polarize rather than to stress the importance of inclusiveness. And of course, now what Washington said, they support ASEAN's outlook, support ASEAN's centrality and unification. But a couple of weeks ago, when Ambassador Liu and I, our institutes cooperate, co-sponsor with some ASEAN think tanks in Jakarta a couple of weeks ago on their understanding, reading of Indo-Pacific. Their most concerned is the competing vision and competing vision of those concepts on Indo-Pacific. And they are worried that ASEAN might be marginalized or even disintegrated because of those competing vision on Indo-Pacific. This is the main reason why ASEAN in this July issued their outlook, focusing, stressing the importance of inclusiveness, win-win cooperation, and ASEAN centrality, which Beijing fully supports. So I think that in that regard, Russia's official position is almost on the same page with Moscow's official position, same page on Beijing. We don't want to, deliberately, intentionally, to try to disunite this area. With regard to the regional economic cooperation, particularly regarding the RCEP, frankly speaking, I think after almost 27 rounds of negotiation for the past 7 years, and the latest rounds of negotiation by all those representatives from ASEAN, China, Japan, South Korea, as well as Australia and New Zealand, I think that they all have a sense of urgency to try to conclude by the end of this November. But there's a big question that whether we should have India in it or out. Frankly speaking, because India is too important. It's a huge market here. And according to a lot of economics model of calculation, if India is in, there will be a mutual benefit. Of course, there's also some challenge for some of those economic sectors, no doubt about that. But Chinese experiences, sometimes the engagement with external market or integration, globalization or regionalization, will play the role of a kind of a leverage to inject momentum for domestic reform, to make the domestic market much more open and competitive, rather than other way around. So I think that in that regard, there are some talking discussions, particularly among the ASEAN colleagues, say that if it is too difficult to bring all the members moving on, why not let's talk about the so-called RCEP minus. As long as we have some people or as long as those members are accountable with the like-minded, we can move first. So this is what I understand of some of ASEAN's understanding, and I think that Beijing is still reluctant to do that. But who knows?
Thank you very much.
The question was raised about the state of India-US relations. I think, if you look at what is happening over the next few weeks, that is a very good, I think, characterization of India's foreign policy, because we have the Prime Minister on a visit to the United States, where he will probably be sharing the stage with President Trump, so which reflects the importance that both countries attach to the relationship. Just as maybe some weeks later, we will be having also a very unique summit, as I said, between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. So this should, in fact, convey to you that we do not see these relationships as mutually exclusive or one, as leverage against the other. Each of these relationships stand on their own as far as our perspective is concerned. There are very good reasons why we see India-US relations as being very important, because the United States of America, of course, we share political values with the United States as democracies. This is something which we attach importance to. Secondly, I think if we are looking at India's economic interests, particularly its aspirational sort of economic strategy of trying to modernize the Indian economy, to have a partnership with a country which remains the most important economy in the world. It is still the source of the cutting-edge technologies across the world. It should come as no surprise that India wishes to have a very strong relationship with the United States. I mean, China itself, at a certain period of its economic trajectory, in fact, had a very good partnership with the United States, because it was helpful to China's economic development. So it should come as no surprise to you that India is looking at the partnership with the US from a similar perspective. Now, yes, there are areas where we do have similar perspectives on international peace and security in terms of what should be, for example, the role of the WTO. On some issues we agree with the United States, on some issues we do not agree with the United States. So there are a number of areas where we have, just as with China, we have areas of convergence, but let me tell you, there are also areas of divergence. For example, there may be more differences if we look at the western flank of India than the eastern flank of India. Whether it is what is happening in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or what is happening itself in the Gulf. As I said, our economic security, our energy security is directly impacted if US policies lead to greater tension in the region or even conflict in the region. This obviously is not something welcome to India. So it's, I think the way to look at India-US relations is to see that there are various reasons why a strong partnership with the United States makes sense for India, but not to see it as somehow, mutually exclusive with our desire to improve relations with China. So that is why I said it is very important that you do not look at your relations with India through the prism of whatever may be the state of your relations with the United States. I think you should look at India's relations with India from based on its own intrinsic value. And as far as the regional architecture and security architecture is concerned, let me just say it is not a question of whether we are trying to contain one country or another, or whether one country can be contained or not. I think when I refer to the fact that virtually all the countries in the region are engaged in a fairly large build-up of military assets, naval assets. Even smaller countries are spending a lot of money on their security. The reason is because they do not have much confidence that currently we have a system through which some mutual assurance can be. So it's not a question of whether we try to contain one country or not. What we are trying to do is that through a multilateral security architecture, you are able to, in a sense, restrain everyone in that grouping. Everybody has, therefore, a reason to not, in fact, engage in unilateralism. Everyone has a stake in trying to accommodate the interests of others, because our interests are paramount, but other countries' interests are not. So, can we construct a maritime security architecture or a security architecture in an overall sense, which provides for that mutual restraint? Not restraining one country or another country, but providing for mutual restraint through mutual assurance. That is how I see this.
Well, thank you very much. So we had, I think, a very good start to this roundtable. We have exceeded the allotted time a little bit, but now I'll pass on to Professor Alkacharya to chair the first session on perspectives in India-China relations. You may have to sort of shorten your session a little bit. So over to Alka.
Thank you, Chair. Little bit means half an hour. So I'm going to be very unpopular with my panelists. I'm going to have to drastically cut down their speaking time. I should be noble and forget any chair's remarks, barring just two very quick remarks which I would like to make to put the discussion that we have in context. By the way, good morning to everybody. I'm just sort of rushing into the session. Nice to see such a big crowd here. So two points that I would briefly like to make here is that I see while the workshop, this roundtable has been divided into two sections, one on India-China and the other on the Indo-Pacific. I see an integral kind of a connect here. And this is based on two postulates that I see as foundation for looking at India-China relations. Number one, I do believe that the last decade, the past few decades, particularly the last 2 decades, has seen a massive improvement in the India-China relationship. And I do believe that between the two states' governments, we have managed to put in place a number of mechanisms which can tackle just about every issue of bilateral nature that emerges. In other words, there is a degree now of confidence and comfort at the bilateral level that we can sort out whatever problems arise between us through established mechanisms and procedures which have proven themselves. But the issues now that are beginning to cast a greater shadow on the India-China relationship are those which are stemming outside the bilateral framework. And the major problems that begin to come on to this relationship is emerging from the region primarily. At the global level, we have always pointed out how many convergences there are between India and China, and those have really contributed to making the India-China position on a large number of global issues very, very close and strong. But it is now the regional dynamics, and these are both structural as well as substantive in nature, and therefore what is going to be the impact of this new geostrategic, geopolitical construct on the India-China relationship, and to what extent is it going to test the ability of the two countries to frankly and freely sort out what may be the areas of distrust is, I think, going to be the number one challenge. And in that context, I welcome President Chan's announcement that they have set up this new center which is going to look at China's engagement with the region and promote more dialogue, more exchanges, more interactions, because I think that we do not really, between the scholars, talk enough. There is very little dialogue, and therefore the wide variety of ideas and of new thinking that exists in the two countries is completely unknown to us. We have to push for those dialogues, and this could be one start. And essentially, as a scholar, I basically am arguing for moving away from an overtly statist discourse on China, because it does not help us to see how much more the two countries are engaging with at the societal level, which is gradually changing the dynamics of India-China relations. So I'll just stop there and ask my panelists to speak for roughly 8 to 10 minutes each. Ambassador Liu Yufa, my colleague here, Dr. Zorawar, and Professor Liu Zhongyi, who are the panelists for this. So 10 minutes, under 10 minutes each, if you could keep your remarks, then we can have some reasonable time for dialogue. Question answers are more often more interesting than the presentation, so can I request Ambassador Liu to start.
So, Madam Chair and all other colleagues, namaste. This is the phrase, one of the few phrases I learned while I was here. I did prepare a little, background information with regard to our relations at the global level. I want to skip because time is limited for me for 10 minutes, so I'm looking at my watch. I'll try. Diplomats have to toe the line, so I'll try to do that. But let me just help you to focus on our bilateral relations. You are too busy probably to look at the figures. By profession, I am an economist. I talk by figures. Okay. In terms of the GDP, your country is only 3.1% of the global total, which stood at 2.7 trillion US dollars, while China stood at 17% of the global total. It refers to that China and India are the two economies within the first 6. And very soon, in PPP term, India is already the 3rd largest economy. So there is, from the economic perspective, since neither side could afford to go forward without the other side. We have a saying, we have the freedom to choose friends, but never neighbors. We two neighbors are too important for any side to neglect or to de-link the other side, or from the other side. Trade, I think last year our trade stood at 90.2 billion. I do not feel happy to see that India is suffering a huge amount of deficit, which stood at 57.2 some billion US dollars. Well, I did a research paper. I did carry out the personal research into why this trade deficit came about to such amount, and what are the ways out. When the time is allowed, I'll try to elaborate. I probably could leave my paper on some other occasion, but at this moment, I just want to flash out in an outline fashion for reference. The investment is not, delight to both sides. Chinese investment is hovering around 3 billion or some US dollars, and Indian investment is also more or less, but you do not see the fact that Tata alone has a huge investment in China. I contributed my part when I was the Consul General in Mumbai to help Tata to buy the Jaguar production company and place the production in China. That product alone generated about 2 billion US dollars worth of sale there. So we're not in great imbalance in terms of investment. The status of areas of cooperation, let me just flash out the areas that we are having the great potentials. Politically, we are fortunate to have the leaders from both sides who have come to the stage of comparing notes from heart to heart, not from the political or diplomatic terms. And this is the best precondition for our economy, for our two countries to move forward in terms of the relations which would be sustainable. And second, we have the great potential in trade. To me, as an economist, I never feel happy to see this figure just lingering forward in such a slow space. We need to do something badly, sooner rather than later. And I think it's up for academians and to do something to enlighten our leaders so that they can seek references from the potentials in the market and the consumption. My supposition is the 21st century is the century that will be decided the capability of each and every country in terms of consumption. See, when we combine the two populations together, it's 1/3 of the global total. So you see how much potential we have there. And the third is the FDI cooperation. We are doing very slowly in terms of bilateral cooperation. The third is oil and gas cooperation. I am scared. If anything should happen to the transportation lines along and through the Indian Ocean, both our economies will have to suffer dearly. So this is the area, a sort of consortium or the bargaining mechanisms. I think this is something we have a great potential there. Infrastructure cooperation. While I was the ambassadorial consul general here several years ago, I had the liberty to travel to about 20 states. I feel feeling proud. But the transportation system is there, much needed for facelift and renovation, and the new system has to be built. China has the capacity, and you have the need. So how can we combine the capacity and the need to form the community of interest in terms of the infrastructure? BCIM is an area. We understand our Indian friends has some reservations on the BRI or Belt and Road Initiative, but the BCIM is an area we could delink it from the BRI. And the AIIB is also an institution that we can work together. As my friends have mentioned, we could do something from the project-based cooperation there. We don't have to refer to something which we could not yet find the agreement yet. The next in line is the tourist cooperation. This is an area where we could spend a lot of efforts to generate schemes for further growth. And industrial parks. I had the liberty to help, to have 2 industrial parks established. I personally involved, but they are not progressing very fast. I think we need to do something there. These are the great areas for potentials. Let me just flash out the outstanding issues, definitely. I am sure. I want to state this. Major relations or mature relations are bound to be accompanied by the complicated issues and frictions. So neither side should be too impatient. So my appeal is more patience have to be abided by both sides. We have to refrain from playing a lot of cards on the table so that we do not have enough time to address those issues at the same time. Definitely the biggest issue, I think, in this regard, is the deficit of the political trust. This is the most important issue here. And the second is the policy transparency. And the policy disalign, or what we call it, the policy disparity. We talk about the same thing, but we do something different. I think I'm blaming both sides. Both sides have to do something. We have to change our mindsets. We have to remodel our roadmaps and try to adopt the operational steps. We should not remain a talk shop. We think 10 people should refrain from continue with the talk shop, but the action team. The next in line is the lack of policy coordination. And the third is security strategies. We do have different understanding and the different policies, which sometimes are contradictory. So we need to have more dialogues on that. And on the last point I want to mention with regard the outstanding is the conflicting regional integration initiatives. I think we do have something different, interpretations and policies. Consequently, the way forward. Let me just come quickly to wind my presentation. I have quite a few proposals. Put it simply, more tradable goods, more tradable area, and this is the only way which we can break the deadline of this increasing trade imbalance issue and the two-way investment. To my understanding, the investment is the only direct way or effective way to address the trade imbalance. I think that this is the shortboard of our bilateral relations. The third is more cooperation in production chains and value chains and supply chains. 21st century is no longer the competition of the whole industries, but concentrated on production chains, supply chains, and value chains. But we're not having these many chains in place yet. The third is, the fourth is cooperation in manufacturing, processing. I personally, I have a mission. I've been invited as the advisor to Changzhou municipality, which allows me to try to lobby for more Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers to go to China. Pharmaceutical area, solar area, rice area, fishery, and you name it. We have quite a few areas which we could work on. The tourism, and education. Next in line is the technology transfer and the cooperation. To go on is the financial sector, energy sector, and the tourism sector. These are the areas we can do. Without further ado, I'm going to wind up here. Geneva.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. That was admirable to make time. I think you said it, what most of the people who are working in this area of India-China economic relations feel and know, that we've just not begun to scratch the potential of India-China trade and cooperation. And I think you rightfully identified areas which have been on the table, but unfortunately we are not simply able to push them rapidly enough. So I think that's once again a reminder of what we need to do very urgently. Zorawar, can I request you to take the floor for the next 10 minutes? The PPT which is being
yeah, he's just switching it on right now.
Precious 1 minute goes by. Shall I switch the order then? It's going to take time. Okay, then maybe we can just request Professor Liu to take the floor by the time technical issues are being sorted out.
Okay. Okay, no problem. Thank you very much. I just would like to share my humble observation on our bilateral relations first. Because as we know, China and India are rising almost simultaneously. So, and I think all of us seated here agree that the bilateral relations is very important to the regional and world peace, stability, and development. But and almost all us, and I think all of us agree that the relationship between China and India is very complex, very complex. So we have a lot of cooperation globally, regionally, and bilaterally. Though there are a large trade deficit between China and India, but China's trade with India, I think, inject vigorous impetus to the Indian economy in the past decades. And there are a lot of unresolved questions. Most of them left over the history. For example, the boundary issues. That issue is the largest obstacle for our bilateral relations, because this issue will recur frequently, just as in the past weeks at Ladakh. So that issue will influence our bilateral relations heavily, and also China-Pakistan relations, Dalai Lama issue, and trade deficit and water resources also hinder our bilateral relations. But I found almost serious problems between China and India was put forward unilaterally by Indian side. It's not by Chinese side. So we found that India has constantly put forward a lot of demands to China. This phenomenon does provide chances for some Western countries to divide Sino-Indian relations. And also recently, in recent years, because China's economic activity in South Asia and the Indian Ocean, especially the advancement of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, in India's strategic suspicion of China have accumulated
So some Western countries have taken advantage of this to fan the flame of the strategic competition or even confrontation between China and India. Today, we can find that both countries' top leaders play the main role in the management of bilateral relations. So the bilateral relationship between China and India is the top leaders guided one. So just as Professor Akaya mentioned, how to enhance our exchanges, especially the strategic circle seated here, I think is very important. To enhance our mutual understanding is very important. Last year, President Xi and Prime Minister Modi held an informal summit in Wuhan, and I think they will continue to carry forward the Wuhan spirit in Mama Round Plan, yeah, please, next month. So, actually, we can find after the Wuhan summit, the bilateral relations have been promoted a lot. But from my own humble observation, I think China and India should change perspective of think about the bilateral relations to further promote the relations. Firstly, I think we should think about the China-India relations from the perspective of civilizations, not just from the perspective of Western geopolitics. We should change our stereotypical mindsets, including sphere of influence, regional hegemony, and Cold War mentality. And secondly, I think we should view the importance of China-India relations from a strategic perspective, rather than only focusing on specific issues. China and India should respect each other and should not take unilateral actions to deteriorate their relations. So I think China and India should develop our relations into an intimate partnership and a new type of major country relations. So how to do that? Firstly, I think in the face of such numerous uncertainties, just allow to scholar mention that, and unprecedented changes, India and China should work together to carry forward the Wuhan spirit and contribute to peace and prosperity in the world, in the whole world and Asia. Because first is that just now we talk about the Indo-Pacific, especially United States Indo-Pacific strategy. This strategy is a military-based, is a militarized one. Because the militarized Indo-Pacific put forward by the United States, it caused serious strategic competition in the region and caused a lot of instability. And as we know, the United States is not a responsible international actor. They will leave Afghanistan depends on their own interest. They will not think about the national interest of India and China and other neighboring countries around Afghanistan. So we should work together. We should work together to contribute to the peace and stability of the region. As we know, Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, they are international commerce. In the ancient time, Pallava dynasty and Chola dynasty, the business merchant ships in Indian Ocean, and at the same time, Chinese Tang Dynasty and Song Dynasty merchant ships also there, and Persian and Arabic merchant ships also there. So I think both the countries in this region should work together to negotiate how to build a maritime security order and architecture, and have dialogue on the maritime security on these issues. To negotiate a non-grouping, open, inclusive, democratic, and equal regional security framework that can include beyond the regional powers such as the United States and Russia. Rather than jointly formulating a set of rules with beyond the regional powers and then impose on other countries in the region, I think it's very important. So I think China cannot negotiate with Quad, but with all these countries, including Russia and ASEAN countries. And the second is that in the face of trade protectionism, anti-globalization, and geopolitical competition, which hindered the regional economic cooperation. So China and India should jointly promote the establishment of an open economic structure and a new framework for regional cooperation. The slowdown of India's economy is closely related to India's low level of integration into global and Asian industrial chains, value chains, and supply chains. And so I think China and India should jointly promote regional economic cooperation arrangements, including RCEP. China BRI can synergize with projects such as Sagamala of India, so enhance the levels of infrastructure in India's coastal areas. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. I'm sorry, we need to really rush this because I would request Director ICS that we will take at least 10 minutes, not half an hour, but only 10 minutes of our extra from our allotted time. Thank you. I think that was interesting. The issues have been very frankly put by Professor Liu, and I think we need to discuss many of the very critical areas of maybe disagreement that came out, and we should be prepared to discuss them in a free and frank manner. But it's interesting the phrase that he used, which is increasingly becoming part of the discourse on India-China relations that I have encountered. It's increasingly the focus is on management of the relationship. And it seems to me that this is a somewhat limited concept because it then focuses more on the problems and they have to be managed. Whereas if we are talking of two mature emerging countries, yes, that is a normal part of the discourse, that you talk about the issues which where you do not converge, issues which are outstanding and so on. So I think the over focus on management does tend to make us less creative in thinking about the possibility.
National studies. We had a fantastic, terrific exchange last year, which was very productive and frank. So I thought I started with this slide because, in fact, it just seamlessly flows from the conversation. I think there's been this debate on India-China relations. What should be the modus vivendi for this emerging multipolar world? This was the one that we had crafted in 1988, the two sides. It's unique because it actually doesn't solve the differences. It allowed them to have this parallel track approach. You have a dispute, you agreed on it, you sort of said that you're going to solve this in this open-ended, peaceful fashion, and while that's happening, you're not going to let that constrain the possibility of cooperation in other avenues. This was actually very different and unique from typical great power, big power, major power accommodations and settlements. You look at the Sino-American normalization in 1979, it was far more substantial in the sense it may not have solved all the differences, but on Taiwan and others, there was a clear sense of that we're going to now move ahead on active cooperation in our common interests. You look at even the Sino-Soviet normalization at the turn of just on the eve of the end of the Cold War. It actually led to a final settlement of their boundary in 2004. So this is something which has been different, and it's been critiqued for not being ambitious enough, but then it's also led to a situation today where you have far more interactions on a whole range of issue areas, as you can see there. It used to be for 25 years, just the border dispute used to dominate the relationship. Today you have multilateral cooperation on order building, global governance. You have a very large, if imbalanced, economic relationship, but it's growing and it's entering into areas after 2014-15 which weren't there previously. Even on the broader region, even in South Asia, you have aspects where are not entirely in dissonance. Of course, there is some element of competition. So this was sort of a statement by the Foreign Secretary just on the eve of the first Wuhan summit. I think we had it's important to sort of step back to see what Wuhan came from. It came from a period of I think we'd all recall that 2 years of very intensive competition and a build-up of tensions in the relationship. But there were also other historical forces that were playing out at this time. You were seeing a broader shift in the global and regional landscape towards multipolarity. I think there was a recognition that there are also these two rising powers. They have responsibilities beyond just their sub-region. They did a lot of order building, promoting new institutions. You have the EIIB, you have the BRICS, you have a whole range of other areas that was also happening simultaneously when you are seeing this new Chinese policy after 2013, 2014 to deepen ties across its periphery and of course in South Asia, which was a very new development for the Indian strategists to now finally seeing China not just focused on the frontiers but actually engaged all around the neighborhood. So I think that created a window or a new chapter where both sides sort of still were coming to terms with this dissonance that had sort of set in. And the Doklam crisis, in a sense, was really a culmination of a build-up of this tension. And I think the resolution of this crisis, I think, really came with precisely when the two leaderships looked at the bigger picture, that it's not just a sub-regional competition, which is a manifestation of a larger transition from the Atlantic to Asia that's been playing out. So now there's always been this critique that Wuhan really was about just setting aside your differences and moving towards convergences. But that's pretty much the framework that we've been following for the last 30, 40 years anyway. So if you want to make a shift from that framework to something a little more ambitious, then you've got to start solving some of your differences. So it's not just the border dispute, it's also, I think, we've spoken about confronting our rival or competing visions on what the nature of South Asia will be in the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. We have to at some stage even speak about Pakistan, maybe in the coming years. Also, what's going to be the role of these new economic initiatives that China is developing in the region. So there's a whole range of questions that are playing out. So what Wuhan did was it sort of reaffirmed the old modus vivendi of the late 80s, but it's obviously responding to a much more broadened India-China relationship. So you're seeing a sense also, I think, at least my reading of this statement was of the press release that the Indian side put out, very comprehensive, that you were seeing also a recognition that now it's not just a rise of China, but it's a rise of Asia. India has been given a certain attention in that. There was also a reassurance that I think has been clarified in the first session, that these relationships are not just cards, but these are independent foreign policy, big actors now that are going to craft some space in this changing transition. You also have this idea of being a stabilizing factor for stability in a world that's under extraordinary change and uncertainty. I think that's been constantly been emphasized. There's this idea of core concerns being reassured. So I think this was maybe the Kashmir episode recently was, I think, a test of the Wuhan, some sense.
many in India, of course, were slightly disappointed by the sort of the boldness, the way China took sort of a very, very Pak-centric approach. I think it's somehow maybe being course corrected, and which will be interesting to see. But I think there was a test for Wuhan to see that can we sort of reassure each other on respecting our core concerns. So it'll be interesting to hear from the Chinese side what their thinking was in that episode, particularly leading up to the UN. The other very important thing that came out in Wuhan, of course, was this guidance to the military establishment. I think there was too much of border management being left into play without political oversight as much as it should have been there. So this was a strict top-down instructions to both sides that now you've got to go back to implementing some of the CBMs that have been in place from the 90s and have been accumulating and building up. So on the whole, it did stabilize the relationship. There's been a critique that Wuhan came from different motivations from the Chinese side. To some extent, it's been said that they did it for tactical reasons. Maybe that's true, yes. The Chinese side needed to stabilize one front. But then, why is that not in India's interest? Do we want two fronts? I don't think so. So I think it was a mutual recognition that we too would like to stabilize this large frontier. And we also need to sort of engage this new chapter of interactions that are happening in this neighborhood. And you can't wish it away. So now you're going to have to increase strategic communication. So a lot of emphasis on starting to see the other's definitions of their interests, what is motivating them, and where can you find common ground. So this idea of India, China +1, I think it was a concept that the Chinese had proposed after Wuhan or during Wuhan. And we did a little bit of work on Afghanistan, training the diplomats, which was of course a symbolic exercise, but perhaps the next stage would be to extending that into other non-traditional areas. So why not look at regime stability or distress migration, non-traditional threats, Bangladesh, Myanmar. There are a whole range of actors in this overlapping peripheries that frankly should not be areas of contestation, but joint responsibility to stabilize these sort of states. So I think that's where the next phase of this India-China +1 concept, assuming that we want to take it forward. Let me just close by very briefly. See, these are some of the questions I would believe that maybe the next sequel to that, which we will see in the coming month or two, when the leaderships will sort of engage. So I think one of the questions that are constantly in our minds, as much as we pretend not to let third parties impact this relationship, there is a broader international environment of changing balance of power, and I think it's always impacted India-China relations, right from the 1950s. There's also a simultaneous recognition in both countries that competition beyond a point benefits third countries in the region and outside. So I think you have these two forces that are sort of playing out. I think I've having seen a little bit of history that I've studied from the 50s, I've noticed that it's only one episode from 59 to 62 where in a changing sort of Cold War environment, unfortunately, when it was precisely this kind of an understanding was required, that Chinese side had massive challenges on its eastern front, India had its own domestic challenges in the sub-region, yet you were not able to craft that modus vivendi to say that we're going to freeze or at least settle down this front, and it actually got enveloped into a vortex of the Cold War. So I think that episode has always been in the mind of Indian and Chinese leaders. Let that never repeat itself in a precipitating crisis, because today we are at precisely that turning point, critical junctures where you're going to have lots of pulls and pressures to assume certain roles, maybe at times overplay our cards, which is precisely what happened in 59 to 62. Both sides did it. And there's no wishing away their miscalculations and the tragedy that ended. So I think there's a strong case to be made that Wuhan, even if it doesn't change the old modus vivendi, by stabilizing at a time of extraordinary change is an important development in itself and should be valued. The one question that I would just leave, maybe the rest can also be covered, I suppose, in a conversation later, is can we establish some sort of a rules of the game in the neighborhood? Because that's a friction point, we've recognized it, But now it's about managing that process. So we have dialogues on maritime security, India, China +1. I think it's about now seeing that you have these two distinct geopolitical visions. The Chinese side, of course, is the one that is changing its behavior because you have changed your regional policy to 2013, 2014, and India has sort of been this status quo actor. So now there is a perception of a power transition or some sort of a changing order in South Asia itself. I think you have to confront that because just focusing on world order, multipolarity, multilateral institutions, cooperation, which is good and which will carry on, won't address this sort of friction or possibilities. So we have to, I suppose, deal with that in a frontal fashion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ravi. I really hustled you there, but I think what you, the issues you've raised will raise further questions. So I really would like the next 15 minutes to be taken up by short, pointed questions to the panelists rather than responses or comments which can be taken outside. Zorawar has put out a rather grim list of issues that could still potentially derail some aspects of this relationship, I think, but hopefully we have the maturity now to tackle them differently from what we did in the past. So,
I have a question to our Indian colleagues, Professor Singh. If Your Excellency, Ambassador Saran could also respond, I would be more than appreciative. About what both of you have mentioned, that the Beijing and New Delhi should think something big strategically to frame bilateral relationship. I think that to substantiate those kind of a big strategic framework, we should also focus on some of the most important transnational or global security challenge or regional challenges so that we could address together. And my question is that given an upcoming summit meeting, informal meeting between two sides, in terms of those political or security chaos or turbulence in Middle East affecting immensely of the global energy market, do you have any specific proposal that if you are asked to give advice to your Prime Minister to say that what I should talk to Prince Xi about those proposals, and do you have any specific idea?
Okay, thank you very much. I have a comment on Kashmir issue. I think on Kashmir issue, it's mainly the problem between India and Pakistan. But also, this issue, your behavior in Kashmir involved our national interest because there are some territorial disputes between China and India in the region. And the second is that I heard that you informed the United States before you take some actions, but you did not inform us. You know, it caused a lot of pressure, domestic pressure to Chinese government. You have nationalism, and also we also have nationalism. So we are facing a lot of pressure. And I would like to ask Zorawar, you just mentioned that can India and China establish a rule of game in their overlapping periphery? I would like to know, do you mean that China and India should divide the sphere of influence? Thank you.
okay, so now the thing is that I'm not going to take 2 rounds, so I just have 5 more people I've identified. We'll take all the questions so that I can give 2 to 3 minutes to everybody. So yes, you had come in first, then you, then him, and then you. Okay, yes, please go ahead. Please keep it a short pointed question.
My point is a very simple one. How does Zorawar think of resolving the conflict between Pakistan and India, which is extremely fundamental in the current situation in the region? And what role can China play in helping India and Pakistan to resolve their differences? Because it looks like a very, very serious problem.
Thank you. Yes.
My question is to Professor Liu. Can you please introduce yourself? Can you
My
tell-
name is
So my question is,
my name is K.S. Subramanian. I was a Home Ministry official.
you are talking
in the
about
past.
joining hands,
Not now.
India and China. India and China should join hands and take on the United States. So I should say, why not India and China join hands and wipe out terrorism out of Pakistan, which is being supported by China in very different ways, Point number two, you talk about Kashmir, and you say your strategic interests. So why not India should, help the pro-democracy movement in Xinjiang province and in Hong Kong, back off China out of Kashmir, the way you are supporting Pakistan. So why not we should support
I think
Hong
the
Kong
question is quite
and
clear. Thank you. Thank you.
Xinjiang?
No, I think the question
Thank
is
you.
quite clear. Thank you very much. So yes,
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Two very brief questions to Ambassador Liu. Two brief questions to Ambassador Liu. One, you mentioned that promoting investment is the best way to improve relations and to improve trade. Now, I recall that when President Xi visited India in September 2014, at that time there was a commitment made to invest $20 billion into India. And you mentioned the figure today is just about $3 billion. Could you mention as to what are the constraints, what are the problems? Because India has been asking for investment from a number of sources. The second question is on RCEP, and President Shen had mentioned about this in the first session. You see, today India has a $105 billion trade deficit with RCEP countries. Out of that, $60 billion is with China. Now, if we are talking about India has to have greater comfort if it wants to become a member of RCEP. And China, we see that $60 billion, global trade deficit of India is $165 billion. That means China accounts for about 35% of India's global trade deficit. So is China willing to open its markets to Indian products? Because you've not done it when there is no free trade agreement between the two. Under the RCEP, if India becomes a member and China has free access to the Indian market, the problem is going to get much worse. So how would China be able to respond?
thank you. Last two questions, Ambassador Deo and Sonia.
I'm Neelam Sabharwal. Thank you. Of course, a word would be absolutely in order, I think, to compliment both President Chen and Ambassador Shamsaran for really setting a really thoughtful framework for the discussions and also having been kind enough to answer the first round of questions. But the issues are obviously so multi-layered, multiple, and so dense that we can barely really scratch the surface. But to come to our immediate panel, chaired so well by you, Madam, I think all panelists have come in from a different perspective, but I should just, for the lack of time, like to come straight to both Dr. Liu's, I think to Dr. Liu, more closer to me. I must say, I commend the forthright and direct approach you've taken to identify what the issues are. I think we go on meeting, and we go on discussing, and we go on finding new phrases of, the defining moments, the strategic moments. We have an opportunity, as was reminded by the chair, to look at some of the hard issues. And I believe you have listed them, and I'm not going to repeat them. But you have suggested an approach, I could just pick out one or two, a civilizational approach and a strategic approach. A civilizational approach, as annotated by you, now we would really need to understand it better, because you say as opposed to the geopolitical Cold War or geopolitical international political approach. Strategic, we had a while ago a very perceptive presentation by Ambassador Shamsaran that how the two sides should really be viewing each other. It was more in a way how China should be viewing India more in a strategic perspective and not just issue-based and as third country arisen kind of a situation. But your definition is different. You said it should be strategically based, but So that means not focused on individual questions. So basically, you suggested two approaches, and I also commend, but that will come up in the next panel, where you have, I think, been bold, and I think that's very helpful for the discussions, where you said, all right, Indo-Pacific is an issue, I think, and how you view it, and that this is part of US's Cold War politics. Perhaps it will be taken up in the next session. I am interested really in the fulcrum of what should be the approach to Indo-China relations, and one humble suggestion, I feel in view of the economic relationship being such an important part of our relationship, we should really have a separate panel each time, because we are now past that time when we used to think economic relations will develop, that will solve the political problems. And we'll talk of international problems and regional and UN and bilateral will be solved. I'm afraid that is not really the reality.
Thank you, Neelamji. Once again, sorry for the listening, but yes, we need to now look very squarely at the issues instead of just going on repeating them pro forma in all the issues. Sonia, the last question goes to you.
So, my compliments to all the panelists who've spoken, but in the interest of brevity, I'll just be the bad fairy at the party and ask you, what are your views, especially from President Chen, on the border issue? Nobody talks about it. We're speaking euphemistically as geopolitical, or other sort of nomenclatures are being used, but what is your view on solving the border problem between India and China?
So now there are questions to President Chen as well, so we have 4 respondents. Let me start with you, Professor Liu, and we've got just 5 minutes to wrap up this question, so please take 2 minutes to 3 minutes each and answer the question.
Okay, thank you. I would like to respond to Ambassador briefly. I think why I emphasize civilization and strategy incorporated together, because now the rise of China and India is a revival of ancient civilization. As we know, from the geopolitical perspective, the United States just would like to use India to counterbalance China. But we are how to say in Prime Minister Modi's thing, 2 bodies, 1 soul. We are different with Western civilizations, and now as we know, in the past year, some Washington policymakers said that the conflict between China and India, between China and the United States, is a clash of civilizations. So I think now is an opportunity to revise the 2 ancient Asian civilization, is China and India. So I incorporate together. Thank you.
Okay, so I think President Chen, would you please come in to the direct questions, and then I would ask Ambassador Liu, and finally.
I think that even if I do not follow very closely about the boundary issues, but with regard to those confidence building, the risk reduction practice, good practice through the history of international relations, I think at least a couple of lessons we should learn or experience. One, that we should follow very strictly on the code of conduct of managing of those complex situations, not let those a specific incident coming out of the control. So in that regard, I think Wuhan informal summit meeting has given a very clear message that the leaders of both sides committed to try to stabilize the situation of the boundary issues and giving a clear direction to those forces of peoples in the contact areas that do not let those incidents escalate going out of control. So I think that's very important. Direct control of that, clear message. Secondly, self-restraint. Self-restraint not only with regard to those specific persons in charge of those areas, but also I think that both sides should self-restraint of their rising of nationalism. We are living in an internet information world. Any kind of small incident will be very easily more amplified, exaggerated, by those media, social media people to say that, okay, there's another kind of a big event, invasion, aggression, something like that. But given a very complicated boundary disputes, there are some, we have not exchanged those map of control, the status quo, control. So it's very easy to, move towards other areas. So I think that we should also, both sides should, we have a different media management situation. Chinese side, even some people say that, okay, the ruling party CPC could control everything. No, it is impossible. It's very difficult. So I think that both sides should, work together to try to, manage those opinions. Not let those ultra nationalist views to try to hijack the leaders' room of flexibility. So I think that will pave way or lay down foundation for a more professional negotiation, behind the scene negotiation. Not that those very complicated boundary dispute negotiation easily exposed to the public.
Thank you. I think just taking off from what you said about let not it escalate and let it not derail the overall relationship, that I think in the main we have managed to allow that, because the one basic thing which makes, for me, which is most significant is that not a single life has been lost on the India-China border since 1967. And if we compare it with the casualties that are happening on the western, I think that's really the ultimate test. But yes, we no longer are in a position where the boundary is really actually dictating the whole relationship. So now, Professor Liu, to you and Zoravar, and I'm going to give 1 minute to a very significant question directed at Ambassador Shamsaran as well. So,
okay. Thank you, Madam. With regard to the 2050 projection of the three great economies, let me just give you my conclusion as an economist. It is the vision to say the best. It's the dreams, the golden dreams, to say the least. My reasons are, economists like to do projections on the models. Model won't tell anything real, because all these projections would have to be marred by the crisis, wars, natural disasters, inflation. The cheapest way to reach that goal is to depreciate our currencies by 50 times overnight. We're there. It's not. So we have to be very careful, reserve our overconfidence. Okay? The second question is with regard to the India, China joining hands to wipe out the terrorist activities in Pakistan. Nobody likes terrorists. China itself is has increasingly become the target, victims of terrorists. China, India, Pakistan all have the collective responsibilities to jointly address this issue. Okay? Without the intervention of the sovereignty of each and every nation. The third question is with regard to the investment. Let me give you two figures. China has managed to import 2 trillion some US dollars in FDI. And China has outflowing FDI totaled at 1.7 trillion, out of which 3 billion came to India. Why? Sir, let me tell you very frankly from the economic perspective. It is not the government's decision. It's the freedom of the business community. They are here. They find where places are ideal for their investment. They're not going to lay their economic eggs where they do not feel comfortable. So our two governments have to do something to improve the policy environment. Okay? And the last question is...
We'll talk about that later, yeah.
We'll talk, we can have more discussion. I have a whole series of papers on that I could share with you. And with regard to the market access in China, China last year, recorded a trade volume of 4.6 trillion, out of which only 90 billion is with regard to the bilateral relations. It's a small potato. I don't like. We should do more, but this again has much to do with the policies, the tariffs. We call it the glass gates, scenarios. We hear very nice sounding policies, but at the desk level, they don't work. We have to break that bottleneck. So these are the things that we need to do. So I have to be quick. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I will request Zorawar to identify two of the most important questions and leave the rest for over.
So I think what you had suggested, that was a very important question. I don't think that's possible to have those kinds of spheres of influence be too entangled, too interdependent, too globalized. But still, I think it's the question worth asking that are India's core strategic requirements in the neighborhood, which is of a peaceful, stable, friendly, interdependent periphery, consistent with China's engagement in the region? I would answer the question that is possible. Of course, on
why
the
not?
It is
Why not?
possible.
Yeah, why not?
It is possible.
Yeah.
And it's possible if, of course, with a certain caveat that China recognizes that India's smaller neighbors have a certain, there is a certain special interlinkage that you do not have with those because of cultural civilization, everything. And the moment you understand that, I think it's quite possible to have a, let's call it a benign competition, which stays sort of muted and never extends beyond normal, let's say, competing for influence with our smaller neighbors, of you giving the weapon, we giving the weapon, and let the best come out of that. So I think that's quite possible.
The collective responsibility.
At some stage, of course. And I think President Chan has asked what is a new initiative on transnational, so why not a radical measure, a joint Indian-Chinese maritime patrol going to the Persian Gulf and accompanying some oil tankers coming to India and China. That'll send a message to India. Yes.
Thanks so much.
So he's already answered that question.
No, maybe.
Well, I would like to just go back to a hat I used to wear before, which was as a chief negotiator on climate change. Because I think if we are looking at the kind of challenges that countries like India and China are facing, one is energy security, and linked to that is the impact of climate change or ecological crisis. And decisions or choices that India and China make today will also have a very major impact on the world as a whole in terms of the kind of ecological crisis that we are facing. So at a certain point of time, we had a fairly close partnership on international multilateral climate change issues, but unfortunately, just before Paris climate summit, that seems to have dissipated. Is there some way in which the two leaders, whose role in this respect will be critical for the future of both our countries as well as for the future, is there some way in which they can announce that they recognize the great critical importance of these issues, not only for us, but for the world, and resolve to sort of create a new partnership, both on energy security as well as on climate change. So it's not only a question of sending patrols and getting oil and gas safely, but to really look at the whole energy picture. I mean, we have participated in the past, by the way. 2005, we said we should, as the largest consumers of oil and gas, we should work together to influence the oil market. We should influence the gas market. Why should we not think about how we can work together? We even have had joint ventures for oil exploration between our countries. So it's not something new that I'm talking about, but is there something that we can sustain over a period of time?
Thank you. I think the climate change, if we can truly come together on that, the future generations will be forever indebted to this India-China partnership as far as the world and saving the world is concerned. So that will be the last word, and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Aika.
We are running quite a bit behind schedule, so we'll have a short break of 15 minutes. We'll come back. We'll have tea in the adjoining room.
Define it as a strategy, we call vision or outlook. I think the emergence of the Indo-Pacific as a geostrategic concept is a response to China's rapid rise from major powers such as the United States, Japan, and India. And I think some countries, maybe such as Japan, Australia, they hope that the United States can play a leading role in counterbalancing China's endeavors in the region. So they developed such a strategy. In the face of China's rise, the United States is trying to reintegrate a regional order and unite regional allies and partner countries to implement a unified strategy. The Obama administration, the rebalance to Asia Pacific policy, I think was essentially a Indo-Pacific strategy because that includes three pillars: military and security one, economic and trade one, as known as TPP, and the last one is value and diplomacy. Compared to Obama administration policy, the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy focuses more on military and security. In January 2019, the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy was fully explained in the Indo-Pacific strategy report published by the U.S. Department of Defense. So far, the U.S. and its allies have taken a lot of measures to realize the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, mainly focusing on military views. In that regard, the focus of U.S. national defense strategy have shifted eastward. The U.S. has strengthened its military power in East Asia and the Pacific region. The U.S. Pacific Commander was renamed the Indo-Pacific Command. The U.S. actively strengthened and built bilateral or multilateral defense partnership with allies and partner countries such as Quad. So, and in terms of economy and finance, they would like to develop the alternative trade and shipping plans, as well as financial frameworks with Japan and Australia. They passed the Build Act. Is considered an international development investment bill, which is directly against China's BRI. Now we can find in this region there are two different propositions regarding the so-called Indo-Pacific region. While the first one analyzes its geopolitical and geostrategic significance, advocating the establishment of political, military, and value alliance from the Pacific Ocean to the western shore of India. The other entails the countries within the region to conduct economic cooperation and expand the industrial trade and financial networks of Northeast Asia to the Indian Ocean in order to prosper the economy, which also formed the basis of China's Belt and Road Initiative. However, it should be noted that the prospect of constructing Indo-Pacific from a geopolitical perspective that was mentioned as the first proposition could lead to military and strategic competition or conflicts, while the second, which emphasizes geo-economic significance, can establish a cooperative context in the region. We find that although the Quad is currently being pursued informally, the dialogue could possibly turn into a military alliance in the future. In addition to the Quad, there are trilateral military cooperation of United States, Japan, Australia, US, Japan, India, and Japan, India, Australia, as well as bilateral military cooperation of US, Japan, Japan, India, US, Australia, US, India, and Japan, Australia, etc. So we can find that these bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral military cooperation may encourage some countries to take military risks. Moreover, the US Indo-Pacific strategy has further aggravated the dualization of political security and economy in the Asia-Pacific region. Unlike Asia-Pacific, that is commonly used as a geoeconomic term, Indo-Pacific is mainly a geostrategic concept. As part of the dualistic structure, regional countries depend on China economically and on the US politically. Since China proposed the BRI, the US, Japan, India, and Australia are concerned that China will dominate regional cooperation. So they will try their best to shape the international order in the Indo-Pacific region through bilateral or multilateral cooperation by setting the so-called positive agenda for regional institutions, strengthening the rule-based international order. And some countries will continue with their endeavor to restrict China in terms of international rules and standards through international mechanisms under their control. In particularly, they will boycott, hedge, and even destroy the Belt and Road Initiative, which will inevitably disturb regional interconnectivity and economic development. Lastly, due to the intensification of competition between China and the United States and the uncertainty of Trump administration, we can find India, Indonesia, and other ASEAN countries have formally put forward their own Indo-Pacific visions or outlook in an attempt to try to lead regional and even global political and economic trends according to their own thinking. But from my humble understanding, I think the success of their goals depend on economic development of the country. So from this perspective, they need economic cooperation with China. I stop here. I would like to hear your response. Thank you.
Our next discussant speaker will be Ambassador Byron Mender, and also 10 minutes.
How do we describe the Indo-Pacific? The Indo-Pacific is a geopolitical construct that brings in key regional stakeholders in a coordinated effort to promote security and prosperity and to restore the balance of power in the region. It is a strategic geography where key global powers are engaged in redefining their roles and relationships to promote their national interests. It is an integrated system that encompasses the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It is an important strategic and economic domain containing slopes that connect the littorals of the two oceans. It is a theater witnessing global power shifts from the West Asia. It is a zone of contestation between the rising power China, which manifestly seeks to create a Sino-centric Asian order, and an existing preeminent power, the United States, which is determined to remain the dominant power in Asia and not to cede further strategic space to China. However, the adoption of the Indo-Pacific as a policy paradigm is viewed separately, uniquely, and distinctly by each stakeholder due to different perceptions of national interest. Where interests converge, there is potential for the development of strategic partnerships in areas of convergence. How do key strategic players in the Indo-Pacific view the region? How would the US view the Indo-Pacific? The National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report marked a significant departure of the US strategic vision away from the focus of countering terror and towards an identification of the sources of the primary threats to the United States as emanating from China and Russia. The NSS and the NDS described China as a revisionist power opposing liberal values, attempting to displace the US and expanding its own influence in the region. The The ISPR recognizes the need for mutually beneficial alliances and partnerships and calls for focused security cooperation, information sharing agreements, and regular exercises. In the Indian Ocean, the United States regards the strategic partnership with India as the focal point. Building trilateral partnerships, strengthening regional institutions through multilateral engagement are also accorded a high priority. Preserving ASEAN centrality remains a vital element in the US vision for the Indo-Pacific because it is at the core of the US-supported regional security architecture in East Asia. How does China view the Indo-Pacific? China believes that with regard to the Indo-Pacific, the following principles should be upheld. First, the focus should remain on East Asia and Asia without affecting the existing cooperation mechanisms and achievements in the region. Second, the focus should be on cooperation and consensus without engaging in geographic confrontation and games. Third, there should be openness and inclusiveness without forming factions or seeking small cliques. China views trilaterals and quadrilaterals as well as minilateral naval exercises as quasi-alliances and therefore undesirable. How does Japan view the Indo-Pacific? Japan has for long embraced the concept of the Indo-Pacific. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in his 2007 address to the Indian Parliament on the confluence of the two seas argued for a regional order based on values of democracy, human rights, and undisrupted access to the region's maritime commons, and floated the idea of a four-country dialogue between Japan, United States, Australia, and India. Japan officially proposed its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in April 2017. The basic threats to Japanese security arise from Northeast Asia, and it seeks to engage major stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific to balance these threats by cooperating with like-minded partners and allies. Japan has strengthened its security alliance with the United States. It has made little progress in overcoming constitutional restraints, playing a more active military role in promoting regional security. Over the years, ODA has been Japan's key instrument for promoting its strategic vision for Asia and Africa. Here, significantly in the recent past, Japan has taken a very different view of the BRI from its principal alliance partner, the United States. How does Australia view the Indo-Pacific? Australia has placed the Indo-Pacific at the front and center of its wider foreign policy and defense strategy. The primary reason for such an evolution of regional priorities has been the increasing difficulty of balancing the growing contestation between its main security partner and its key economic partner. Second, being an island nation, Australia is dependent on secure slocks and the freedom of navigation to the Indo-Pacific region. The developments in the South China Sea and the challenge they pose to the existing rules-based order have given rise to concerns in Australia on the safety of the slocks. Third, Australia perceives its strategic interest in the South Pacific directly challenged by China in an area long considered by Canberra to be its patch or backyard. Finally, the debates surrounding China's alleged role in targeting Australian institutions and domestic politics has become a complicating factor in managing the bilateral relationship. How does ASEAN view the Indo-Pacific? ASEAN's reluctance to embrace the Indo-Pacific as a framework to conduct policy was on account of a number of reasons. First and foremost, there were fears that the adoption of the term would invite an adverse Chinese reaction. China's interpretation of the Quad as a quasi-alliance and its association with the US Indo-Pacific strategy and policy also added to ASEAN fears and reluctance. Second, in the ASEAN view, there was a lack of clarity on the free and open Indo-Pacific and what it exactly stood for. This was because the Indo-Pacific geopolitical construct was a work in progress and there continued to be nuanced differences in the articulation of the concept within the Quad members themselves. Third, there were growing ASEAN fears, so clearly articulated by Singapore Prime Minister in his address at the Shangri-La Dialogue, that prolonged US-China tensions and the pushback against globalization would undermine the economic prosperity of the region. Indonesia was the first ASEAN member to embrace the Indo-Pacific as a new paradigm and framework for policy making. Indonesia's vision for the region is balanced and inclusive and linked to President Jokowi's characterization of the archipelago as the global maritime fulcrum. The emphasis is on giving a maritime orientation to Indonesia's foreign and domestic policy and focusing on the creation of maritime infrastructure, attracting investment and promoting trade. The security dimension is accorded a lower priority. The AOIP is a giant leap for the ASEAN grouping. ASEAN has finally taken a step, albeit hesitantly, to embrace the Indo-Pacific, but in the ASEAN way at a pace comfortable to all. Following are some of the key takeaways from the statement. ASEAN does not see the Indo-Pacific as a single strategic geography, but as rather as a seamless maritime space and a region of dynamic economic integration combining of the wider Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean region. It perceives the Indo-Pacific as lying at the center of geopolitical and geostrategic shifts, which present unprecedented opportunities for economic growth as well as risks of miscalculation and conflict due to the rise of powers in the region. Placing itself at the center of these two maritime regions and acting as a conduit and portal, ASEAN will seek to shape the political and security architecture and work towards keeping the region peaceful and stable. To this end, ASEAN will strengthen existing ASEAN-led mechanisms and primarily the ICS as platforms for dialogue and implementation of Indo-Pacific cooperation. ASEAN's centrality will continue to be the guiding principle for the economic and security architecture of the broader Indo-Pacific region. In shaping the new security and economic architecture, ASEAN will be guided by the principles of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. The Indo-Pacific outlook does leave open the possibility of developing at a later stage an appropriate ASEAN document for the Indo-Pacific region. This could be interpreted as leaving the door open for an Indo-Pacific treaty proposed by former Indonesian Prime Minister Martin Natalegawa, envisaging a TAC-like framework for the peaceful settlement of disputes and the non-use of force. ASEAN will also promote cooperation in connecting the connectivities, clear reference to the desire to harmonize the competing connectivity initiatives promoted by great powers. ASEAN will remain Southeast Asia centric, and a key area of cooperation activity will involve reinforcing and strengthening the master plan on ASEAN connectivity, and it will also explore synergy with sub-regional frameworks like the IORA and the BIMSTEC. How does India view the Indo-Pacific? India's official position on the Indo-Pacific was laid out by Prime Minister Modi at the Shangri-La Dialogue on June 1, 2018. Today, India has a well-defined Indo-Pacific policy, an Act East policy, and a Neighborhood First policy, as well as an Indian Ocean Outreach policy. India regards the Indo-Pacific as a single strategic geography that will shape the future of the international order. It stands for a free, open, and inclusive region which embraces all countries in the common pursuit of progress and prosperity. India adheres to the paradigm of strategic independence and would like to ensure a peaceful, prosperous, and stable region in which all states are governed by the same rules. The focus of stakeholders would be on seeking solutions to developmental challenges rather than being caught up in great power rivalries. India supports the freedom of navigation, overflight, unimpeded commerce, and principles of international law, particularly the UNCLOS, as the constitution for the oceans. It also encourages the resolution of territorial and maritime disputes through peaceful means in accordance with universally recognized principles of international law. While acknowledging that the security remains the vital component of the Indo-Pacific, for India, the framework is a holistic concept that extends to cooperation and engagement in economic, developmental, connectivity, and cultural domains. Through Sagar, India assures that it will do everything to safeguard its mainland and islands and defend its interests. These interests include the safety of shipping, fishing, seaborne trade, energy, assets and resources in the maritime domain, and Indian citizens working overseas. How do we assess the Indo-Pacific as a strategic paradigm? The Indo-Pacific is a strategic geography, and there are different conceptions of the space depending upon who imagines it. It seamlessly connects the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and it's a product of globalization, trade, and the rise of Asia and the global economy. The global strategic shifts currently underway are the reason why it has become a contested space. As a policy paradigm, it's a work in progress. Managing the disruption caused by the rise of new strategic heavyweights is the key challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Our next discussant is Dr. Cao Jiahan, who is the Research Fellow of SIS.
Thank you, President Chen, and distinguished guests. It's my great pleasure to visit India for the first time. and especially the prestigious Institute of Chinese Studies here in New Delhi. I'm trying to be very brief to leave more time for discussion later. As I'm working on energy environment issues, I'm trying to focus on the transition of energy landscape domestically and regionally in the Asia-Pacific region, and what's the implications for China and India cooperation. So the first aspect is the transition of the energy mix at a domestic level in both China and India as two most prominent rising powers and emerging economies in the region. So a typical phenomenon in recent years is the diversification of the energy mix of China and India. But we have to ask two questions. What have been driving this forward? What's the momentum behind? Is both countries have been value the environmental dimensions, because in China we have the political guidance from President Xi that his thoughts on ecological civilization and his famous judgment that Green Mountains and Russell waters are invaluable assets has become a national consensus. And this is driving our green development in recent years. And in India, the country is also faced with very typical and severe environmental problems. And President Modi has been promoting the development of solar power, wind power, and renewables, and has been made the country become a leader in the world in the generation of renewable capacities in recent years. So, and on the other hand, we have made pledges in the international community after the adoption of the Paris Agreement on climate change and the United Nations 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. So next week, Prime Minister Modi will lead the Indian delegation to join the general debate in the UN General Assembly, and our State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi will also lead Chinese delegation. We have the commitment at the international level. So this also bring us many domestic pressures to balance economic development and environmental development. So this is the common trend domestically, and also created a lot of space and room for bilateral cooperation in terms of technologies and other cooperation in the United Nations and the other international levels. So the other transition is the energy security landscape at the Asia-Pacific region. That we, since 2014, we have seen a major change in this region, that we have two new emerging players in the energy markets of Asia-Pacific. One is Russia. Russia is traditional power in terms of energy, but it's new, relatively new in the Asia-Pacific region. And the other emerging power player is the United States, since the country have successfully achieved its energy independence, that as a long desired dream by many administrations before Trump, that the country has become a leading energy producer in the world, and also bring many implications to the Asia-Pacific market. So the two new players in the Asia-Pacific region has also brought many positive elements to China-India cooperation. As our previous speakers mentioned, China-India can do a lot of things, as to form kind of oil buyer clubs to increase the bargaining power, something like that. And many other negotiations are still on the way between our two countries. And the U.S. As a new market player in the Asia Pacific also can help China and India diversify our mix. That especially on the fossil fuels, because fossil fuels like oil and gas will still dominate our energy mix in the short and middle term. So we have to diversify it. So even for Russia, China and India both have a closer cooperation with Russia in the in recent 5 years in order to diversify. And the U.S. Energy independence also bring other implications geopolitically because this can give U.S. more other political leverage. Since 2014, especially after the Crimea annexation, the Russian annexation, Crimea, that the U.S. and the Western world has put sanctions on Russia. This helped Russia to move eastward. That means, and also China and India can increase our asset distribution in Russia's Far East. So this is also help China and Russia join hands in this regard. So these two transitions, domestically and internationally, will create huge implications for China and Russia to join hands in the energy sector, and also leave a lot of space for future negotiations and collaborations. So this is my brief talks, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chao. Our last discussion speaker is Vice Admiral Anil Chopra. He is a distinguished fellow with the Canada International Foundation and a former member of the National Security Advisory Board. So, Admiral.
Thank you, Chair. Very good afternoon to all of you. Thanks to ICS for having me here. I am the last speaker before lunch, but I think people are more patient because of that, and I intend to take my pound of flesh in spelling out some of the things I wish to say. There is a caveat. I'm speaking in my personal capacity and more as a military maritime commentator. And I think that would include a healthy dose of realism and possibly a tinge of political incorrectness. But I will try, and I just want you to note what we are talking about is the Indo-Pacific now, and not Indo-China necessarily. So I think I have a little more leeway than most. You know, any talk on the Indo-Pacific requires an idea of the area, so I'm fond of putting up only maps, no slides. And this is the sort of thing which people talk about the Indo-Pacific, which is mainly a maritime construct. But is it so? Is the Indo-Pacific today just a maritime construct? That's a question to ask ourselves. What is it? It's not really a natural geography. There is very little connect between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It's only between those 4 straits in Indonesia that these 2 oceans are connected. So it's not a natural sort of connect. Nor is it a strategy, as most people like to say, a US strategy for China containment, and China perhaps believes so. It is basically an artificial construct with economic and strategic ends of all the players who are involved. But why did it come about? Because the players are they carry heft. And I'll very briefly go through what I think are the reasons why this Indo-Pacific came about in the first place. As always, it's economic to start with. I think most people don't realize the dependencies of the East Asian economies, that is China, Japan, and Korea, on the resources of the Indian Ocean. China, Korea, Japan, hugely dependent on oil. China also hugely dependent on the excess manufacturing capability it has to find markets. And the underdeveloped littoral of the Indian Ocean is a great place for China to find those markets. All countries, let alone China, have an interest in the energy, in trade, in investments, markets of this whole littoral, especially Central Asia and Africa, which are underdeveloped and which are the new El Dorados. And last but not least, people want economic stability. There is talk of the center of gravity of the world, economic center of gravity moving eastward, more trade. People are worried about their trade. They want stability from state conflict, from non-state conflict, non-traditional. It impacts business because the moment there is tension, insurance rates go up, shipping rates go up, all trade costs more, everything is more expensive. Everybody wants this area to be stable. And I would think the country which has the most stake in the stability of the Indo-Pacific is China. Because China needs its oil from the Indian Ocean, China has huge amount of trade going in and out of the Indian Ocean. So I would think that it is China which needs to think about how to stabilize this area. The strategic reasons for the Indo-Pacific were clear. The rise of China, the ambitions of China, the Chinese dream, Xi Jinping, say what you wish, led to the concerns of the United States, of Japan, of India, of ASEAN, and even of France and the EU. And Chinese actions were not just in the South China Sea, but in the beefing up of the PLA Navy, in the BRI, in the presence in the Indian Ocean, and its yuan diplomacy, which led to what people sometimes refer to as dead traps. The second strategic reason was on part of some to include India in the Asia-Pacific matrix, and therefore some people say that it was the wanting India to be inclusive in this area that the Indo-Pacific strategic driver. But last but not least, most people don't realize that the United States assets have to be split between the Middle East and the Pacific. They come from the same place. They come from San Diego through Hawaii, and they have to split between the Western Pacific and the Middle East. And that is why there was a need for the Americans to look at this whole thing in one way, and that is why in one fashion the Indo-Pacific Command has come about. There are no assets, naval assets of the United States are based only outside the Indo-Pacific, so to speak, on the east, west coast and otherwise. Anyhow, so this was a recap of what were the drivers and what is happening. Very briefly, what I'm going to talk about is the recent developments. Recent means that I suppose 2 years, but I'll start by saying what has remained the same and what has changed. What has remained the same is it is free and open, Indo-Pacific. There has been no firefight, there is no effect on global trade, there are tensions in various areas, but the Indo-Pacific remains free and open. Nothing has changed on the ground. In fact, some would say it remains free, open, and inclusive. And that's where we want to head, but nothing has changed. The gravitational pull of the Chinese economy is changing the behavior of many people, for good or bad, but that remains the same. The gravitational pull is very strong, and that remains the same factor. China's maritime geography, I do talk about this because it's an integral part of the region. You know, look at this thing ahead of you. Unfortunately for China, it doesn't have a very good maritime geography. It is sort of, its access to both the Indian and Pacific Ocean is hemmed in. We've all heard of the Malaccas, and Sunda and Lombok and Mumbai states in Indonesia, which guard the entrance to the Indian Ocean. But this first and second island chain also is a barrier. And there are places like the Bashi Channel, which is between Taiwan and the Philippines, and there is a Miyako Strait. There are for Chinese maritime forces at least, the geography is difficult. And this, in my view, maybe as a maritime guy, is a factor which China definitely is cognizant of, and which will play a little part, as indeed it did in Russia and Germany, none of whom could be major maritime powers due to their geographies. Geography is destiny, and that's the way it is. And I think we need to look at, this remains the same. I'm talking about what all has remained the same. The code of conduct in the ASEAN Beijing Code of Conduct remains the same. No progress has been made except for talks. The RCEP and the TPP both remain elusive. That is also not changed. The so-called US operations, the freedom of navigation ops continue. Peacetime deployments of Chinese and other navies in the Indo-Pacific continue. People are getting more and more places, in my view, no bases in the Indian Pacific. There are very few real bases. I would argue, and we can discuss whether things like Djibouti is a base for the Americans or the French or the Chinese or the Japanese or anybody else. So this is the part which has remained the same. What has changed in the last few years? The geography of the South China Sea had been changed earlier, but what has now happened is it is weaponized and militarized, which is a fact on the ground. and therefore China has changed the geography of the South China Sea. This has made their strategy of anti-access, anti-denial very much more effective. It is going to be difficult for navies in conflict with China, whoever they may be, to get over the fact that the anti-access, anti-denial strategy in the China seas has become exceedingly more effective because of the weaponization of the South China Sea. The PLA Navy force levels have gone up considerably. They have been commissioning almost 18 to 16 ships every year, which is more than all the rest of the navies in the area combined. And therefore this has changed. China's maritime military position within the Western Pacific is much stronger. But China's maritime strength outside the Western Pacific has not changed very much. There is global weakness. The Chinese recognize it. They are not able to deploy in the manner of the Soviets, and I don't think they are in position to certainly go into combat across all the portions of the world. So there is an issue which is recognized in that level. What all has changed? Quad has been revived, even though there are differences in the members of the Quad as to how they see Quad. But the fact is, in the recent past, Quad has been revived. Maritime capacity building in Japan, Korea, that is Republic of Korea, and Taiwan has increased. And there is huge maritime capacity build up in these areas. I can't go into the details now. The ability for maritime domain awareness and intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance on part of all nations has increased considerably with intelligence sharing. And as you know, India now is going to operate a fleet of 22 P8Is, for example, and Australia has 15. And they're being based and they're operating from places like the Andamans in the case of India, and like Christmas Island and Cocos Island in the case of Australia. What I'm just trying to bring out is this is nothing to do with being anti-China. It is just maritime capability of various nations in this region has increased considerably over the last 2 years. Along with that intelligence capability, most nations have developed a quick interdiction capability to suit their strategic needs. So forget the military and maritime. What else has changed? There is a trade and tariff war which has started between the US and China. This has its own implications for Chinese economy and Chinese military, even though this can be debated, the jury is still out, but we'll have to see.
Admiral, 1 minute.
Sorry, all countries of the region are engaged with China, but there is a certain amount of pushback. There are trilaterals galore. The Australian position is hardening. Russia is ambivalent, and French have got into activism in the Indian Pacific. On the other hand, there is good Japan-China détente of sorts in which the Japanese and the Chinese are talking. There is the Wuhan consensus with India. There is the attempt of the ASEAN countries to engage China in dialogue. So I'm giving you a both side picture. The other part is the Indo-Pacific has now got implications because of the continental belt of the BRI. Europe has got a little bit more interested. China's continental belt reaches now up to Tehran and further. The INF treaty has been sort of abrogated. There are issues and concerns. I'll leave it at that. And 1 minute exactly on 6 points which I think will play out in the Indo-Pacific. One, a lot will depend on the Chinese economy and therefore in its capacity to sustain its military might and enhancement. This may be linear, it may not. It's certainly not going to be logarithmic as it was. The US cannot afford to leave this region for whatever reason, because unless it's a Pacific power, it's not a global power. If it just becomes an Atlantic power, it will be an Atlantic power. So it will believe India will follow a free, open, inclusive Indo-Pacific, as the ambassador pointed out. The triangle between China, the Koreas, and Japan in the Northeast Asia unfolds every day. It's a place to watch. And last but not least, Indo-Chinese cooperation in actual sense of the word, which we discussed in the last session, is possible if there's a mature outlook on both sides. And I would even go on to say that maritime cooperation is possible to some degree. In conclusion, it is, I think, going to be more framed, the Indo-Pacific, by what China wants. Whether China sees itself as a responsible power over the whole region, or it is just interested in being a China sees part within the Western Pacific. This is a big decision for China, which we will all have to watch. And China, whilst engaging in the Indian Ocean region, will have to look at its soft power and many other issues which have come up once you cross across the Malacca Straits. In this very brief time, I just tried to give you an overview, but there are issues which are there in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we still have 20 minutes for free discussions. And I think that the previous the discussion has put a lot of the topics on the table. And I think that this reminds me of the three questions I think is quite interesting and important. One is what is the driving force of all those different proposal, vision, or strategy on this area? Some people say that it's money. Some people say that it's military. Some people say that it's mine. And some people say that it's a networking. Okay, I think that for all those things, they are all important. Play a very important role in the various degree. As long as we have all these three N plus N plus one N together, it will have a more appealing, attractive our local vision that will drive all peoples, or drive all other countries together. Second one is, what is the, I found that some of the, during the discussions, as well as some of the articles, materials I've read, and there's kind of an imbalance when we're addressing those Indo-Pacific or Asia, Indo-Pacific areas development. Three kind of imbalance. Imbalance of overemphasize, overstressing the security dimension, but less mentioning the economic dimension. The second imbalance refers to when we talk about the security, we always have in our mind of those traditional security, while neglecting or pay less attention to those non-traditional security. The last but not least imbalance is that when we talk about those security mechanisms, we are always talking about those conventional security mechanisms. Stress the importance of alliance, but I think that nowadays we should also pay more attention to those inclusive security mechanisms, multilateral security mechanisms. The last question in my mind is that when we're talking about those architecture building in these areas, what should be those principles? What should be the shared values that we should work together for those architecture buildings? So I will leave those questions on the table to supplement our already very interesting discussions points of view. Now the floor will be open, and I will in this counter-crossway, right? Crosswise. Okay, start from.
The aim of these discussions should be to narrow, of course you put across your point of view, but also to identify areas where we can cooperate and narrow down our differences. Now we have a land boundary dispute which we are trying to resolve, discuss, but there is an issue coming up between our two countries, and that is on the maritime front. Now, right now, for the last 10 years, both our navies have been expanding, our footprint has been expanding, and it was only in 2008 that the PLA Navy first came into the Indian Ocean, ostensibly for anti-piracy operations. And thereafter, your footprint has been increasing. We see now intelligence ships, missile tracking ships, submarines, and bases or places. So, and you see the Indian Navy participating in Malabar or Quad, etc. So there is, a new front of misunderstanding which is opening, and there is no forum for discussions. We don't have any Navy to Navy staff talks. We don't have a bilateral naval engagement. So I suggest that before, and you have your submarines, so they come and operate there in the Indian Ocean, and we have our long-range maritime patrol aircraft, and they try and bother those submarines quite obviously. And the same thing is applicable when our ships go into the South China Sea. So I think we should develop a framework for Indian Navy, PLA Navy naval engagement. We must have staff-to-staff talks, Navy staff-to-staff talks. We must have a maritime communication mechanism to discuss before these misunderstandings, take a larger view.
So the next, please keep in mind of your time, all right?
Right, thank
2
you.
minutes or 3 minutes.
Just very quickly, we talked about the strategic ambiguity and uncertainty. I think the point here, maybe the panel can answer that, and more so our Chinese scholars who are here. Really, there is no clarity as to exactly what China's maritime claims are, either in South China Sea or elsewhere. On the international line, we're talking about the force Shah, as they're being called now. So exactly how do they, unless there's clarity on these issues, and I think China perhaps the only country which has not defined its claims in a manner as to make them intelligible to the other interlocutors in the entire Indo-Pacific region, it becomes very difficult as to what kind of architecture structure we're thinking of building. That's one point. The second is in terms of Quad. Now, of course, this is one of the formats for collaboration. There are several other formats. But as the Prime Minister said in Shangri-La Dialogue, that India is open for other formats. And therefore, the whole idea of, let's say, this kind of cooperation framework developing in a cooperative manner is that they're open this possibility of formats. China and everybody, everybody can be part of different kind of formats. So I think we need to, of course, we need to be constructive in our spirit, but also still we need to understand really what the other country wants. Thank you.
Okay, I think that China actually has this clarity of its claims, but I would not rule out that some of the clarity are disputed. Right?
We'll discuss over lunch.
Thank you, sir. My name is Anurag, and my question is to you, sir, or Professor Liu. Sir, there is a counter narrative that China is focused in South Asia primarily to contain India, because India possibly only India has the potential, economic, civilizational, to possibly contain the rise of China, which is a Middle Kingdom narrative where other countries are tributaries, vassal states paying tributes. Now, this narrative is supported by facts, which are that since 2000, 80% of China's arms transfers have been to countries in South Asia, and 3 countries to be precise: Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. All the countries that China is giving offensive capability to in the form of submarines, Myanmar, Thailand, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they all are in India's neighborhood. There is also a narrative that China is trying to, with India's smaller neighbors, raising the bogey of China, India's hegemony, and supported by fact of signing an ocean observation agreement with Maldives, or Hambantota, or Chofio in Myanmar, or Coco Island, or Pekua in Bangladesh, or Gwadar in Pakistan. So I would like to have your views on this, sir. That would it not be right for India to have hedging strategies in view of such a focused, determined engagement of China against India in the maritime domain in South Asia? And also, sir, to your observation, you said that BRI, India, along with some other countries, have ganged up together when China started its BRI. The question is, India has made its position clear on BRIs, that it addresses legitimate sovereignty and territorial integrity concerns. But why BRI is such an opaque mechanism? Why is it a hub and spoke concept where every country has to have an MOU with China? Why are the legal disputes only to be decided in China, along in accordance with Chinese laws? So your comments on these as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
My question is addressed to you and the other panelists. Let me mention that I have served in China. I've been following the relationship with great interest for a long time. What is my rhetorical question is, what is in India's interest? And it's in India's interest, I would argue, to have cordial ties with China. It is in India's interest. It's as simple as that. And when friends from China and others say that we are following the US lead to contain China or damage the ties, I would very politely disagree, because we are not a small country. We know what is good for us, and what is good for us is to have good relations with China. Now, having said that, I would feel that I would argue that good relations need trust. And I am posing a very simple, straightforward question. Unfortunately, I would argue that there is an acute trust deficit between the two sides, despite what we are trying to say, what we are trying to do. Now, from the Indian perspective, for the last 20 years or so, 30 years, we see that there has been no forward movement from the Indian perspective on any key issue of concern to us, whether it is the boundary issue, whether it is the issue of terrorism, whether it is your support to Pakistan, whether it is now the Kashmir issue. The new issue comes up is the BRI issue. Then on the trade, instead of removing the non-tariff barriers, your answer is that if there is a $60 billion trade deficit, let's take the target to 500 billion. So, very respectfully, I would say that we are engaging in homilies instead of addressing the real issues and trying to build trust. Now, is this the way forward, or can we do things differently? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I will take very brief one. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, President Chandru Scan, I was actually prompted by a remark made in the beginning, in the morning today in the panel, when Ambassador Liu Yaofa said that we should look at the strategic issues rather than the specific issues. Now, having been a China watcher for some time, even though on the periphery, China's rise over the last 4 decades has been very impressive, extremely impressive. And while till about 2 decades ago we were still debating China as a part of multipolar system, etc., the fact is that the way China has risen economically and strategically in terms of its own strength, China is now being talked about as G1. If G1, the top country, like USA became G1 at the end of the Cold War, China is soon about to acquire the status of G1. At least that is where the path seems to be leading really. Now, developing countries, particularly in Asia and Africa and even in this region, had a kind of a safety wall where there was multipolar system and they could basically survive, or they could protect their interests in the multipolar system, talking to the different countries, one protecting the other. In that system, when China becomes G1, China is the top dog, so to say, as the Americans say it, where does the accommodation for weaker systems, nations, come in? Now, I'm saying that basically, even if India has a semblance of strength, India is still nowhere close to China is. I'm being very undiplomatic here, but even though I retired from diplomatic services, I suppose that I can now afford to be undiplomatic. India is nowhere being close to China. And I don't think that we can ever really think of comparing with China in either economic strength or military strength, at least for the next 2 or 3 decades, when China would already reach the top one. In that system, what I would like to know is, how far would China go to accommodate aspirations, ambitions, interests of its own neighbors? Vietnam, Bhutan. We were talking at tea with Ambassador Muni. He is now basically having taken a nap. Okay? So we should not again, we were wondering really where is it going to go in terms of an overall strategic balance over the next 2 or 3 decades. Thank you.
Chair, I'll just.
I think that because we still need some time for response.
So I'll be very, very short, very simple. My question is also addressed directly to Professor Liu. Small question. First question is, recently in the South China Sea, you have a Chinese exploratory vessel with destroyers, 4 of them, moving into the Vietnam contested zone, and Vietnam also got 2 destroyers moving. And this has been going on for the last 2 months. What is the, and both sides have said that these are our waters, and you have just now said you look at the whole zone as peace, and it's out. I mean, you got reports from both your governments. What is your view on this? The second question is very simple. You had your problems. This is a very simple question. It's a Suez Canal. You got the Malacca dilemma. You got the other thing. Thailand has got a Suez Canal coming up. Are you all really looking at it, or you're not looking at it?
Okay, I think that sorry, that gentleman, because we have to close our question.
Is it because I asked bad questions?
No. We can talk during our lunch table or something, because I think that we need to, it's a fair play. We need to leave.
I would have asked my question by this time. I asked question very pointed.
So I think we will leave our colleagues to respond in a very briefly, maybe 2 minutes for each. That's enough for all of our panelists. So who would like to, if you are going to give up your time and leave more time to other colleagues, that will be also okay. So maybe to me, Professor Liu, you would in your mind of the time.
Okay. Because so many questions. I just would like to say several words on BRI. I don't think the BRI, the design of BRI, is to contain India, because it's from Chinese understanding, it's a economic cooperative initiative, because it has 2 dimensions. Domestically, we would like to develop the western part and the middle part of China. So we would like to make our economic development regional imbalance more balanced, and use this process. And the second is that the BRI is the top-level design of Chinese next step opening up and reform. We just would like to have more and more economic connection with not only with developed countries, but also with developing countries in South Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, and Africa. Because in the past decades, we increased our economic connections with Western countries. But in the future, we would like to also increase our economic relations with developing countries. So, from my understanding, it's the purpose of BRI. But many Western strategies, they think China's BRI is a geopolitical design. It's not true. I just can say that. Thank you.
So, are you going to pick up some questions to briefly respond?
I have to add up something about BRI. BRI's problem is obvious because the concept is very grand and ambiguous. So this is lead to some misunderstandings and misperceptions as China's conspiracy to rule the world finally, and also another post-World War II Marshall Plan. So this is not true. I have to say the development dimension of the BRI has been largely ignored by many countries, including maybe India, because we need infrastructures. India badly needs infrastructure domestically and then regionally. There's a huge gap in this area. But how to co-shape the standards, how to co-shape best practice with regard to BI is on the shoulder of all others. So this is my comments. Thank you.
Well, I suppose pretty much everything has been said. My only remark on the Indo-Pacific is that whoever is looking at it should look at it with realism, with what is on the ground, with capabilities, not intentions. It's a good motto to keep in mind, capabilities, not intentions. The Indo-Pacific is a very large area. There are 5 distinct sub-regions in the Indian Ocean and 4 distinct sub-regions in the Western Pacific. 9 sub-regions, there's very little chance of a single overarching architecture and security. Why I keep going back to security, I'd rather go to economics. Because actually what we all really want is a prosperous, economically competitive region. But all the missing apprehensions are on the security and strategic fronts. And they come about because of, in the recent past, I must say, and most people will agree, because of China's, if not aggressiveness, but assertiveness in its local area, which is fine from China's perspective. But what it has led to, which is also quite clear, is a certain amount of pushback and a certain amount of scramble for minilaterals. Do you know the amount of trilaterals which have been signed in the region? You surely know. You know, Japan, Australia, India, Indonesia, Thailand, India. There are all sorts of minilaterals people are getting into. There is apprehension, and partly, I think China, if we are going to be frank, while it has its own national interests, it must really come to terms with the fact that most of the security apprehensions have come about in the last 10 years or so because of China's possible actions, whether China sees it like that or not. Thank you.
We can conclude. Maybe you can say a few words. Okay. Well, again, thank you very much for all those panelists and as well as our colleagues to have your inputs and comments. Many questions I have no time to respond, but we will leave that on our lunch table and further discussion about that. I fully understand that time is not limited and time is not enough to address all those questions. But such kind of a frank discussion is very important.
President Chan, I will not be at lunch. I'm making an intervention. Sorry, very sorry to say, I'll not be at lunch. So can I invite you to please react to my question? That will be of interest to all the Indian participants who are here. If you don't mind, if you would like to just park it, I mean, that's your prerogative.
Your question is about the lack of trust, right? This is your question?
Yes, my question was about lack of trust, that there has been very little or no forward movement. So how do we build on the relationship if as we see it, our core interests are not taken on board? Thank you, sir.
Okay. Well, as I said, that as two big countries, it's not easy to neighbor countries with such a complicated historical interaction. I think that it's not so easy to deal with those trusts, as on both sides also on the right simultaneously. Aside from those potential source for potential conflicts and disputes, I agree some of your colleagues mentioned. I think maybe Ambassador Sun has just mentioned. First, we need to cultivate a sense of empathy, right? Empathy, that to understand each other's most sensitive issues, and in our domestic policy making implementation, always keep in our mind that the domestic policy has its international implications, and also to take into account the other side in this way. So I think this is very important. Secondly, the most important thing is if we just to delve into those details of differences. I think the best prospect is we can only try to manage those differences, but there's no time or room for innovative thinking about what is a long-term prospect of accommodation, let alone those a big plan or blueprint for the rise of cultural renaissance of each other and working together for a more better and prosperous region in the world. So I think that in that regard, the leaders, the think tank people, those opinion leaders, those intellectual communities, we need to think something big and to work out a strategic framework which will adapt to the new political economic landscape. We are living in a new era. The world is much more vulnerable. The earth has come into the new era. Anthropocene has replaced the traditional geological terms. So we need to work together on those, including those climate change issues. This is our common responsibility. And we also need to work together that these two developing economies, they are playing the leading role in pushing forward the new round of global modernization. The first round of 2 rounds of global modernization led or initiated by Great Britain and the United States. But now we move to the new era that more than 5 billion people around the world have already on the track of modernization, from those least developed areas into the middle income and to the upper and more advanced status. Those kinds of a new round of modernization, I think that India and China, we play a very important role to pushing that and to lead in that way. Of course, by working with the developed economies. So I think the challenges are overwhelming. This is I just listed 2 of them. The global modernization, as well as how to deal with those more vulnerable world. My point is that in those new era, those differences, historical, geopolitical, they are deep-rooted. But we should change our mindset to look at the more important one. If, let's say that maybe 50 or 30 years later, when a lot of our cities has been flooded because of global warming, it makes less sense to continue to focus on those boundary issues, actually, to some extent. So I think that we should move forward and for those common challenges. So this is my point, is that first, and second, we should have a more broad strategic framework to govern our relationship. I'm not quite sure whether those arguments, because I'm not quite sure that this kind of arguments is convincing enough, but this is the only way that we can address those differences and find a way out.
Understood. Thank you.
I will leave the Ambassador Kanter.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Chan. Let me first of all thank President Chen and other colleagues from Shanghai Institute of International Studies for joining us in organizing what I believe has been very productive discussion this morning. I would also like to thank India International Center for collaborating with us. I wish we had more time for discussions, because one can see that so many questions have come up because of paucity of time. Perhaps full response could not be given, but we'll continue this conversation in India, in China, and we'll have more occasions. So let me thank all of you once again and invite you to join us for lunch. Thank you.